Welcome to the Clockmaker's Final Client. I am your host, Holmes's friend, Dr. Watson. Thank you for joining me on another journey, but before we start, let me know from which city are you watching from, and what was the first Sherlock Holmes story you ever heard about? Chapter 1. The Clockmaker's Silence. The winter of 1895 came to London not with the dramatic fury of a blizzard, but with the slow, suffocating patience of fog. It crept up from the Thames in the small hours, settled upon the rooftops like a grey wool blanket, and refused to lift. By the third week of January, the city had taken on the character of a place half remembered, familiar shapes rendered ghostly, the clatter of hansoms muffled to a distant murmur, and even the cries of the street vendors dulled to something that might have been the moaning of the fog itself. I mention the weather not for atmospheric indulgence, but because it bore directly upon the state of my friend Sherlock Holmes during that dismal period. Holmes without a case was a dangerous instrument, a finely calibrated machine with no work to perform, and therefore liable to perform work upon itself. He had spent the morning of January the 16th in a condition I had come to dread, stretched upon the settee in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling with the intensity of a man who sees not plaster, but the failures of the universe to furnish him with adequate stimulation. I had tried conversation. I had tried the morning papers. I had tried, with some desperation, reading aloud a passage from a monograph on tropical diseases that I thought might engage his scientific curiosity. He had listened to approximately 9 words before raising one hand and saying, "Watson, if I wished to be bored by medicine, I would have attended your lectures," which I considered unfair, as I had never delivered lectures and he knew it perfectly. Well, by 10:30, he had progressed to the revolver. I heard the first shot from the upstairs landing, where I had retreated under the pretence of fetching a book. The sharp crack was followed by 2 more in quick succession, and I descended to find Holmes standing in his shirt sleeves, the pistol in his right hand, and a faint haze of smoke drifting across the sitting room. The wall above the fireplace bore a fresh arrangement of bullet holes. He had, I observed, added the letter E to the VR, already pocked into the plaster, though what the E signified I did not ask, as I feared the answer might be ennui. "Holmes," I said, with what I hoped was the firmness of a medical man addressing a patient, "Mrs. Hudson will have your head." "Mrs. Hudson," he replied, setting the revolver upon the mantelpiece, "has survived worse provocations than interior decoration. Besides, the wall was already ruined. I am merely continuing a theme." He turned to me with an expression I knew well, the restless, slightly feverish look of a mind consuming itself for lack of fuel. "Watson, I have not had a case of any substance in 11 days. 11 days. Do you know what 11 days is to a man of my temperament? A holiday? A death sentence served in hourly increments." He flung himself back onto the settee with the gracelessness of a man who has ceased to care about the cushions. "London is a city of 5 million souls, Watson. Statistically, a meaningful proportion of them must be engaged at this very moment in acts of deception, theft, fraud, or violence. And yet, not one, not a single enterprising criminal among them, has had the courtesy to present me with a problem worth the expenditure of a single neuron." I was formulating a reply. Something about patience being a virtue, which I knew would be received with the contempt it deserved, when we were saved by the sound of the front door, followed by the heavy, deliberate tread of a man who climbed stairs as though each step were a concession to civilian architecture. "Lestrade," said Holmes, without turning his head. I had long since stopped marvelling at this particular trick. The inspector's footsteps were as distinctive as a signature, the tread of a man who wished to convey authority, but whose boots were a half-size too small, producing a slightly clipped rhythm that no amount of professional dignity could disguise. The door opened and Inspector Lestrade entered. bringing with him the damp chill of the fog and the vaguely harassed expression he wore when a case was proving either too simple to justify his attention or too odd to fit comfortably into a report. Today, I suspected the latter. "Mr. Holmes," he said, removing his hat and holding it before him like a man presenting credentials. "Dr. Watson, I hope I'm not intruding." "You are absolutely intruding," said Holmes, swinging his legs off the settee with sudden energy, "and I could not be more grateful. Sit down, Inspector. You have come about a death." Lestrade paused mid-step. "How did you... You are wearing your Tuesday overcoat, which you reserve for morgue visits, as it is the one your wife least objects to having smell of carbolic. There is a faint chalk mark on your left cuff, consistent with the marking system used at the Clerkenwell mortuary, and you have the look of a man who believes he is wasting my time, but has come anyway, which means someone has insisted, presumably the bereaved party, that the death is not what it appears. Please, sit." Lestrade sat. He placed his hat on his knee and regarded Holmes with the complicated expression of a man who resented being read like a shop sign but had grown accustomed to the indignity. "It's a clockmaker," he said. "Name of Elias Hargrove. Workshop on Clerkenwell Close. Found dead yesterday morning by his apprentice. The body was at the foot of a shelf ladder, one of those tall affairs on rails, the sort you'd use to reach the upper storage. There were clock parts and tools scattered around him, and a heavy marble mantel clock on the floor beside him. It appears he climbed the ladder, reached for something on a high shelf, lost his footing, and fell. Struck his head." "And," said Holmes, "and that's all there is to it, as far as I'm concerned. The man was 68 years old, working alone late in the afternoon. The shop was locked when the apprentice arrived next morning. Accidental death. I'd have filed my report and gone home except that the apprentice, a young fellow called Finch, came to the station in a terrible state and all but demanded we treat it as murder." "On what grounds?" Lestrade shifted in his chair. "He says his master was too careful a man to fall from a ladder. Says Hargrove had been climbing that ladder for 30 years without incident. Says the old man had the balance of a cat and the caution of a Swiss banker." He paused. "It's sentiment, mister. Holmes, the boy is grief-stricken and looking for someone to blame. There's nothing at the scene to suggest foul play." Holmes had risen from the settee during this account and moved to the window, where he stood with his back to us, his hands clasped behind him, gazing into the fog as though it were a canvas upon which the facts might arrange themselves. "The door was locked, you said? From outside?" "The front door, yes. It's the only entrance. The apprentice, Finch, had to fetch a neighbour to help force it open." "And Hargrove's key?" "Not on his person. Not found in the workshop. We assumed it was mislaid, fallen behind a cabinet perhaps. The premises are extraordinarily cluttered." "You assumed?" Holmes turned from the window. His expression had undergone a transformation I had witnessed many times but never tired of observing. The restless irritability had vanished entirely, replaced by a focused, predatory stillness. His eyes were bright. He looked, if I may say so, like a different species of creature altogether, no longer the languishing patient, but the hound that has caught a scent. "A man dies alone inside a locked room," Holmes said quietly. "His key is missing. These two facts, Inspector, are not merely interesting. They are incompatible with your theory. If Hargrove died of an accidental fall inside his own locked workshop, his key must be either on his person or somewhere inside the shop. If it is neither, then someone else used that key to lock the door from the outside after the death occurred. And if someone locked the door from outside, then Hargrove was not alone when he died." Lestrade opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. "It could have been mislaid earlier. He might have lost it days before and been using the spare." "Was there a spare?" "On a hook inside the door, yes." "Then why would the apprentice need to force entry?" If Hargrove had been using the spare, it would have been on his person or in the lock. No, the spare was inside because it had not been used. Hargrove had his own key when he entered that workshop for the last time. And now it is gone. The silence that followed was of the particular variety that Lestrade produced when he was revising his professional opinion without wishing to admit it. He smoothed his hat brim with one thumb and said, "You'll want to see the scene, then." "I shall want to see the scene, the body, the apprentice, the appointment ledger, and every square inch of floor between the workbench and the ladder." Holmes was already moving, snatching his coat from the hook, his hat from the table, his magnifying lens from the mantelpiece beside the still warm revolver. "Watson, your coat, and bring your medical bag. If this man's death has a story to tell, I suspect the wound will be its most eloquent chapter." Within minutes we were in a hansom, rattling through fog so dense that the driver navigated more by memory and instinct than by sight. Holmes sat in his customary posture, chin tucked, eyes half closed, fingers drumming a silent rhythm on his knee, and said nothing for the duration of the journey. I knew better than to interrupt. He was assembling the frame of a puzzle from the few pieces Lestrade had provided, and any word from me would be an unwelcome gear in the mechanism. Clerkenwell Close, when we reached it, was a narrow lane of soot-darkened brick, its shops and workshops huddled together like men sheltering from a storm. The fog clung to the buildings with a particular tenacity here, as though reluctant to release its grip on the ancient street. I could see why. There was something of the previous century about Clerkenwell Close, an air of craft and patience, of work done by hand in rooms where the light was never quite adequate. Signboards advertised watch repairs, clock restorations, and instrument calibrations in lettering that had not been refreshed in decades. Hargrove's workshop stood midway, along the lane, its facade modest and its windows dark. A constable stood at the door, stamping his feet against the cold, and touched his helmet as Lestrade approached. Inside, the workshop was precisely as one might imagine the inner sanctum of a man who had devoted his life to the measurement of time. Clocks of every description crowded the walls and shelves. Tool-case clocks, carriage clocks, skeleton clocks with their mechanisms exposed, bracket clocks of walnut and mahogany, and dozens of pocket watches hanging from hooks like mechanical fruit. The air smelled of brass polish, lamp oil, and something older, the accumulated patience of decades. And there, at the base of a tall shelf ladder near the far wall, the chalk outline of a dead man marked the spot where Elias Hargrove had been found. Holmes stood in the doorway. He did not enter immediately. I'd seen this before, the long, sweeping survey that preceded his more detailed examination, the way his eyes moved. Across the room with the systematic precision of a man reading a page. He looked at the chalk outline, at the ladder, at the items scattered on the floor around it, brass gears, clock housings, the heavy marble mantel clock Lestrade had mentioned. He looked at the workbench, a massive oak affair with an iron corner brace, its surface cluttered with tools and components. He looked at the floor, the old stone flags, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Then he looked up at the high shelf from which Hargrove had supposedly fallen, and his eyes narrowed. "Lestrade," he said, still standing in the doorway, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who has seen something that others have not. "You see a man who fell." He stepped inside. "I see a man who was placed." Chapter 2. Gears and Dust. Holmes moved through the workshop with the peculiar grace of a man who understood that a crime scene was a text written in the language of objects, and that every displaced item was a word, every surface a sentence, every absence a paragraph of its own. He did not rush. He did not speak. He simply moved, from doorway to workbench, from workbench to ladder, from ladder to shelf, with the slow, deliberate patience of a reader who knows that the meaning of a passage often resides not in what is written, but in what has been erased. I remained near the door with Lestrade, who watched Holmes with the guarded expression of a man who had learned, through years of bruising experience, that silence during these initial examinations was not merely advisable, but essential. The last time Lestrade had interrupted Holmes during a scene survey, he had received a look of such withering disappointment that he later confessed to me it had troubled his sleep. "Watson," Holmes said, without turning, "the body has been removed to the mortuary." "Yesterday afternoon," Lestrade confirmed. "Standard procedure." "Naturally. Watson, you will examine the body at the earliest opportunity. For now, I shall need your medical opinion on a matter of geometry." He was crouched beside the chalk outline, his lens inches from the stone floor. "Come here, if you please, and tell me what you make of this." I crossed the workshop carefully, stepping over the scattered debris, a brass clock housing, several loose gears, a winding key, and knelt beside him. Holmes pointed to a spot on the floor approximately where the back of Hargrove's skull would have rested. "There is a small quantity of blood here, consistent with the reported head wound. Now." He rose and moved to the base of the tall shelf ladder, which stood against the far wall on iron rails. The ladder was a handsome piece of workshop furniture, mahogany rungs, brass fittings, designed to slide along the rails to provide access to the high shelves where less frequently needed items were stored. If a man falls from this ladder, say from the 4th or 5th rung, a height of approximately 6 feet, and strikes his head upon this stone floor, where would you expect the primary impact to occur? I considered the mechanics. A man reaching upward, losing his balance, falling backward. The crown of the head, most likely, or the occipital region if he fell directly backward, possibly the temporal region if he twisted during the fall. And the character of the wound. A broad contusion. The floor is flat stone. The impact would be distributed across a relatively wide area. There might be a fracture beneath, but the external wound would present as a diffuse bruise with possible laceration, depending on the force. Excellent. Now, Lestrade. What did the examining physician note about the actual wound? Lestrade consulted his notebook. Concentrated wound at the base of the skull. Linear in character. Deep laceration with... He squinted at his own handwriting. With sharp margins. "Linear," Holmes repeated. "Sharp margins. A concentrated impact at the base of the skull." He looked at me. "Watson, that is not consistent with a fall onto a flat surface," I said, the professional certainty sharpening my voice despite my efforts at measured neutrality. "A linear wound with sharp margins suggests the head struck a narrow edge, something fixed and angular. A flat stone floor would produce entirely different characteristics." "Precisely." Holmes moved to the workbench. It was a massive structure, clearly decades old, built to bear the weight of heavy clock mechanisms and the sustained pressure of detailed handwork. Its corners were reinforced with iron braces, L-shaped brackets bolted to the wood, their edges worn but still sharply defined. Holmes lowered his lens to the corner brace nearest the chalk outline and remained there for a very long time. "Watson, here." I looked where he directed. The iron edge of the brace showed a faint discoloration, so faint that in the dim workshop light it might have been mistaken for old rust or a shadow, but under Holmes's lens it had a character that I recognized from years of medical practice. "That has been wiped," I said. "Recently. The surrounding metal has the patina of years, but this section, perhaps 2 inches along the edge, has been cleaned, and that discoloration beneath is consistent with a blood residue that was not entirely removed." Holmes nodded slowly. Then he did something that struck me at the time as theatrical, though I later understood its purpose was purely analytical. He straightened up, positioned himself with his back to the workbench at approximately the spot where the corner brace protruded, and allowed himself to fall backward in a controlled, slow-motion pantomime, His skull stopped a precise 2 inches from the iron edge. "A man standing here," he said, still in his peculiar tilted posture, shoved forcefully backward, would strike the base of his skull against this edge. The wound would be linear, concentrated and deep, matching the examining physician's description exactly. The floor, Watson, had nothing to do with it. He righted himself and moved immediately to the stone flags between the workbench and the ladder. Dropping to his hands and knees, he brought his lens so close to the floor that his nose nearly touched it. He moved in a slow arc, inch by inch, his breathing shallow and controlled. "Here," he murmured. Then, with more emphasis, "Here, come and see." I crouched beside him. The stone floor was old and unevenly worn, and in the thin winter light filtering through the workshop's small windows, I could see what had caught his attention. A faint arc scored into the grime of the floor. It was perhaps 3 feet long, curving gently from the direction of the workbench toward the base of the ladder. The mark was not deep. It might have been made by dragging something heavy across the stone. "Boot heels," said Holmes. "Dragged. The arc is consistent with pulling a body by the shoulders. The heels trail and scribe a curve as the bearer adjusts his path." He produced a small measure from his pocket and laid it across the mark. The width between the 2 parallel scores, you can see the second one here, fainter but present, is approximately 16 inches. That corresponds to the shoulder breadth of a man of Hargrove's build. "You believe the body was moved from the workbench to the ladder?" "I do not believe it, Watson. The floor tells me so. Hargrove died at his workbench. Someone dragged him 3 feet to the base of this ladder and arranged the scene to suggest a fall." He stood and brushed the dust from his knees with an abstracted air, as though the grime of a murder scene were a minor social inconvenience. "Now, the shelf." The tall shelf ladder ran along the full length of the workshop's rear wall, providing access to 4 tiers of storage. The upper shelves were crowded with the overflow of a lifetime's accumulation: clock housings, replacement, parts, boxes of glass faces, rolls of chain, and various items too large or too infrequently needed to occupy the precious workbench space. Holmes climbed the ladder with the agility of a man half his age and brought his face level with the uppermost shelf. He was there for some considerable time. I watched him move the lens slowly across the shelf's surface, pausing at intervals, occasionally blowing gently to disturb the dust. When he descended, his expression carried the cold satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. "Dust, Watson, is the most honest witness in any investigation. It cannot lie, it cannot be bribed, and it cannot be frightened into silence. This shelf has not been disturbed by regular use in months. The accumulation is uniform and undisturbed, except in several places where objects have been recently removed. The items found on the floor, that is the interesting part. The objects scattered around the body include a marble mantel clock, 2 brass clock housings, and a set of winding tools. Now, when an object sits undisturbed on a dusty shelf for several months, it leaves a precise impression, a clean shape in the dust corresponding exactly to its footprint. The brass housings are rectangular, and I can see rectangular gaps on the shelf where they obviously sat. That much is consistent. But the marble mantel clock, a round-based piece, leaves a circular footprint, and there is no circular gap anywhere on this shelf. There are only rectangular ones. The clock didn't come from the shelf. It most certainly did not. It was placed on the floor to embellish the staging. Whoever arranged this scene grabbed items from the shelf to scatter convincingly, but included at least one object, the marble clock, that was taken from elsewhere in the workshop. The dust, as I say, does not lie. He descended the final rungs and turned to survey the workshop with the comprehensive gaze of a man assembling the last pieces of a mechanical puzzle. Then he crossed to where a canvas apron hung on a hook near the workbench, Hargrove's working apron, left where the dead man had last placed it. "This was on the body when it was found?" he asked Lestrade. "Around his waist, yes. Standard working apron. Nothing remarkable about it." Holmes lifted the apron and examined each pocket in turn. From the right breast pocket, he withdrew a folded cloth, a soft rag of the kind used by craftsmen for polishing brass and wiping surfaces. He unfolded it beneath his lens and held it near the window where the thin light could serve his purpose. "Blood," he said quietly. "Faint, but present. This cloth was used to wipe a surface that bore a small quantity of blood. The smear pattern is consistent with a single directional wipe across a narrow edge." He looked at the iron corner brace of the workbench. Our killer cleaned the impact point and tucked the evidence back into the dead man's own pocket. It was either remarkably cool piece of thinking under pressure, or the instinct of a man accustomed to tidying away inconvenient realities. He folded the cloth carefully and placed it in an envelope from his coat pocket. Then he turned to face the workshop's entrance, where a young man had appeared, slight, pale, with the red-rimmed eyes of someone who had not slept in 2 days, and the careful hands of someone trained to work with things more delicate than his own grief. "Mr. Finch, I presume," said Holmes. Samuel Finch nodded. He was perhaps 23, with sandy hair that fell across his forehead, and the sort of face that would have been unremarkable in a crowd, but became, in this context, a study in quiet devastation. His hands, and I noticed Holmes observing them with particular attention, were the hands of a craftsman, calloused, precise, with fingertips that bore the distinctive marks of fine metalwork. He wore a workman's jacket that was too large for him, and I suspected it had belonged to Hargrove. "Mr. Finch," said Holmes, his tone shifting to something warmer than his investigative mode, but far from sentimental. "I understand you were the last person other than his killer to see Mr. Hargrove alive. I will need you to tell me everything about that day. But first, you told Inspector Lestrade that an item was missing from the workshop." Finch's gaze went involuntarily to the workbench, to a cleared space near the centre that was conspicuously empty amid the surrounding clutter. "The Vaucanson watch," he said, and his voice carried a weight that went beyond the loss of a valuable object. "Master Hargrove's most treasured piece, an automaton pocket watch made by Jacques de Vaucanson in 1743, also Master Hargrove believed, and he was not a man to make such attributions lightly. When you opened the case, a tiny mechanical songbird would rise and move its wings and beak as though singing. The movement was driven by a spring mechanism so fine that Master Hargrove said it made the finest Swiss tourbillons look like farmyard machinery. And this watch was here on the day of his death? On the workbench that morning. I saw it there when I arrived at 8 o'clock. Master Hargrove was examining the mainspring. He said the bird's song had developed a slight irregularity, and he wanted to correct it before showing the piece to a visitor that afternoon." "A visitor?" "He mentioned an appointment at 4 o'clock. A gentleman coming to have a carriage clock appraised. Master Hargrove seemed pleased about it. He enjoyed appraisals, said they were puzzles in themselves." "And you left at what time?" 2 o'clock. I went to collect brass fittings from Marchetti's on Cheapside. It's a regular errand. I go every Tuesday." "And when you returned the next morning, the shop was locked, your spare key was inside, and the Vaucanson watch was gone?" "Yes." Finch's composure faltered for a moment, and he steadied himself against the doorframe. "Nothing else was taken. Not the Breguet carriage clock, not the Tompion bracket clock, not even the loose gold in the cash drawer. Whoever did this, they only wanted the Vaucanson." Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his gaze resting on the empty space on the workbench, where a mechanical songbird had sung its last song in the presence of the man who loved it most. Then he crossed the workbench, opened the leather-bound appointment ledger that lay beside a row of jeweller's screwdrivers, and turned to the page for January the 15th. He studied it in silence. Then he held it up so that I could see the entry, written in the careful, slightly archaic hand of a man who had been forming letters since the reign of William IV. 4 p.m. Pacific Time, carriage clock appraisal. Holmes closed the ledger and tucked it beneath his arm. "Mr. Finch," he said, "you were right to come to the police, and the police were right, however reluctantly, Hamar, to come to me. This was not a fool, Watson. This was a performance, and like most amateur theatre, the set dressing is all wrong." He turned to Lestrade, who had been standing by the door with the expression of a man watching his own professional assessment collapse. "I shall need this ledger. I shall need Watson to examine the body this afternoon, and I shall need you, Inspector, to resist the urge to file this as an accident for at least 72 hours. Lestrade sighed the sigh of a man who had learned that Holmes's requests, however inconvenient, were seldom wrong. 72 hours. After which, said Holmes, pausing at the doorway to cast one final look across the workshop, at the silent clocks, the scattered evidence, the chalk ghost on the floor, "I expect we shall have rather more to discuss than a fall from a ladder." We stepped out into the fog of Clerkenwell Close, and the grey air swallowed us whole. Chapter 3. The Appointment Ledger. That afternoon, while I attended to the melancholy business of examining Elias Hargrove's body at the Clerkenwell mortuary, Holmes returned to Baker Street with the appointment ledger and a silence that I had learned to interpret as the early stages of intense cerebral activity. By the time I rejoined him at 4:30, the sitting-room had been transformed into what Mrs. Hudson would later describe, with characteristic understatement, as a state. The appointment ledger lay open on the dining table, surrounded by a constellation of scribbled notes, a London street directory, 2 volumes of the Horological Society's membership register that Holmes had evidently procured during my absence, and the remains of a pot of tea that had gone cold hours ago. Holmes himself stood at the mantelpiece, pinning a sheet of paper to the wall above the bullet holes with a hat pin. On it he had written, in his angular hand, the initials P.T., and surrounded them with a network of radiating lines, each one representing, I supposed, a possible avenue of inquiry that had occurred to him and been either pursued or discarded in the hours since Clerkenwell. "Watson," he said without turning, "your findings." I settled into my chair and consulted my notes. The wound is exactly as you predicted. A concentrated linear laceration at the base of the skull, 4 inches above the foramen magnum, approximately 2 inches in length with sharp, well-defined margins. The underlying bone shows a depressed fracture consistent with striking a narrow, fixed edge with considerable force. There is no bruising pattern suggestive of a fall from height, no secondary contusions on the shoulders, elbows, or hands, which one would expect from a man who attempted to break his fall, even instinctively. The hands are entirely unmarked. "The hands," Holmes repeated, turning now with a gleam of approval. "Excellent, Watson. A man who falls from a ladder reaches out. It is involuntary. The body's last negotiation with gravity. Hargrove's unmarked hands confirm that he did not fall. He was struck, or rather, he struck a fixed object while being propelled backward by external force. The absence of defensive injuries is equally telling. He was not beaten. The struggle, if there was one, was brief." "There was one other matter," I said. "Beneath the fingernails of Hargrove's right hand, I found fibres, dark wool, consistent with a gentleman's overcoat. The mortuary attendant had not noticed them, but they were present under the index and middle fingers." Holmes's eyes widened fractionally, the closest he came to visible excitement in matters of evidence. He grabbed at his assailant. He seized the man's coat or sleeve during the struggle. Dark wool that narrows nothing at this time of year, but it confirms physical contact with a visitor. Well done, Watson. That is a thread we may yet follow to its source. He returned to the appointment ledger and tapped the open page. Now, our mysterious PT. Hargrove's ledger is a model of professional order. Every appointment recorded with the client's name or initials, the nature of the work, and the agreed time. I have cross-referenced every entry for the past 3 months against the Horological Society's membership rolls and the trade directories. Every appointment matches a known client or tradesman. Every appointment except this one. PT, carriage clock appraisal, 4 o'clock on the 15th of January. The initials correspond to no regular client, no society member, and no known dealer in the Clerkenwell district. A new client, then? Precisely. Someone who came to Hargrove for the first time, or at least someone who had not previously appeared in the ledger. The question is how this appointment was arranged. Hargrove did not accept walk-in trade. Finch confirmed that all appointments were made in advance, typically by letter or in person at the shop. If PT wrote to Hargrove, there should be a letter. I've asked Finch to search the workshop correspondence, and I have sent Wiggins and 2 of the irregulars to make inquiries among the postal carriers on the Clerkenwell route. He paced to the window and back, 4 strides each way, a distance I could have measured in my sleep after so many years of watching him think. But the ledger is not the only witness we have. I want you to go to Clerkenwell Close tomorrow morning, Watson, and speak with the tea-shop owner, a Mrs. Doyle, whose establishment sits directly across the lane from Hargrove's workshop. Lestrade's men took a statement from her, but Lestrade's men have a talent for asking questions that confirm what they already believe. I want you to ask questions that discover what we do not yet know. What am I looking for? Everything. The man she saw entering the shop at 4:15, his height, his build, his clothing, his manner. Did he arrive on foot or by cab? Did he carry anything? Did he seem familiar with the lane, or did he look about him as a stranger would? And most critically, did she see him leave? Lestrade's report mentions only the arrival. The departure is unaccounted for. I agreed, and the conversation turned to other aspects of the case. Holmes had, during the afternoon, compiled a preliminary list of individuals connected to Hargrove: his nephew Leonard, his apprentice Finch, his professional rival Heinrich Voigt, and a handful of regular clients whose appointments bracketed the fatal day. He had sent telegrams to each requesting interviews, and had dispatched the irregulars on a broader mission to canvass the shops and vendors of Clerkenwell Close for anyone who had observed unusual activity on the afternoon of the 15th. It was late evening before he spoke again of the initials on the wall. PT, he said, staring at the paper above the mantelpiece as the fire burned low. A man who made an appointment under his own initials, or at least initials that correspond to a real name, and then committed an unplanned murder. That is an interesting combination, Watson. A professional criminal would have given a false name. A careful planner would have left no trace in the ledger at all. Our PT is neither. He is a man who came to the workshop with a purpose that fell short of murder, and who left with a crime he did not intend to commit. The initials are the residue of a plan that went wrong. You believe the killing was unpremeditated? The staging was improvised. The wrong items from the shelf, the marble clock that never sat there, the cloth hastily tucked back into the apron. These are the decisions of a man thinking on his feet, not executing a rehearsed plan. He came to steal, Watson. The Vaucanson watch was his objective. Murder was the complication. He knocked his pipe against the grate and reached for the tobacco in the Persian slipper. Tomorrow you will visit Mrs. Doyle. I shall visit a nephew. The tea shop of Mrs. Agnes Doyle occupied a narrow frontage on Clerkenwell Close, directly opposite the darkened windows of Hargrove's workshop. It was the sort of establishment that had existed in London for generations. A low-ceilinged room with steamed windows, mismatched china, and the permanent fragrance of strong tea and toasted bread. Mrs. Doyle herself was a stout woman of perhaps 60, with sharp eyes set in a face that suggested She missed very little of what occurred on her stretch of pavement. She remembered the afternoon in question with the clarity of a woman for whom the rhythms of the lane constituted both entertainment and occupation. "I saw him, yes," she said, pouring me a cup of tea with the firm authority of a woman who did not accept refusal. "A gentleman, not the sort we usually get on the close. This is a working lane, Doctor, craftsmen and tradesmen mostly. But this one was quality. Tall, well-made, dark overcoat. Very fine cloth, I noticed, the sort that holds its shape in the damp. Top hat, and he carried a walking stick with a silver head. I remember because he turned the stick in his hand as he stood outside Mr. Hargrove's door, the way a man does when he's considering something. He hesitated before entering. Only a moment. He looked up at the sign, then at the windows, then he went in. It was around 4:15. I know, because I had just put the second kettle on for the afternoon trade, and I always do that at 4. Did you see his face? Not clearly. He had his back to me when he stood at the door, and when he turned to enter, the brim of his hat was low. But he was clean-shaven, I'm fairly sure, and there was something about his bearing, very upright, very composed, the sort of man who knows he cuts a figure and doesn't mind that he does. And his departure, Mrs. Doyle? Did you see him leave? She frowned and set her teapot down with the deliberateness of a woman assembling a memory. That's the thing, Doctor. I didn't see him leave through the front. I was watching, on and off, not prying, mind you, but the close is quiet in the late afternoon, and a gentleman visitor to Mr. Hargrove's is noteworthy. I served 2 customers between 4:30 and 5, and each time I glanced across, the shop door was still closed. When I looked up at 5:30, the shop was dark and shut. He must have left while I was in the back room fetching milk. There's a gap of perhaps 10 minutes around 4:45 when I wasn't at the window. So he departed sometime between 4:30 and 4:45. If he went out the front door, yes. There's no other way out of Mr. Hargrove's shop. I've been across the lane from him for 12 years, and there's only the one door. I thanked Mrs. Doyle and finished my tea, which was excellent. Her account confirmed the timeline Holmes had constructed. The visitor arrived at approximately 4:15 and departed before 4:45, giving him between 15 and 30 minutes inside the workshop. Time enough for an appraisal that became a theft that became a killing, followed by the grim business of staging. I returned to Baker Street to find Holmes in his coat, pulling on his gloves with the economical movements of a man who has reached a decision and intends to act on it before the decision has time to cool. "Mrs. Doyle?" he asked. I relayed her account. He listened with his eyes half closed, nodding at the details of the dark overcoat, the silver-headed cane, the composed bearing. When I reached the departure gap, he opened his eyes. Between 4:30 and 4:45, he needed 20 to 25 minutes. 5 for the appraisal pretense, 2 for the theft attempt, 1 for the struggle, and 15 for the staging. That is consistent with the scene evidence. He adjusted his hat in the hall mirror. Your Mrs. Doyle is a better witness than half the constables in Lestrade's division. Now, I have spent the morning with Leonard Hargrove, and I must tell you, Watson, that the nephew is either a murderer or the most transparently wretched man in Bermondsey. I incline, at present, toward the latter, but the distinction requires further investigation. You visited him this morning? At his lodgings, a second-floor room in a boarding house on Jamaica Road, the sort of place where the wallpaper has given up and the landlady charges extra for hot water. Leonard Hargrove is 34, employed as a clerk at a shipping firm, and in debt to a Whitechapel moneylender to the tune of approximately £40, a sum that does not sound catastrophic until one considers that his quarterly salary is 12. He was nervous, defensive, and made the elementary mistake of attempting to conceal a threatening letter that was sitting in plain view on his mantelpiece. I read it while he was fetching me a glass of water he did not want to fetch. And his alibi? He claims he was at a public house in Bermondsey from 6 o'clock onward on the evening of the 15th. The barman recalls a man matching his description, but cannot specify the time of arrival with any confidence. It is, in short, the sort of alibi that proves nothing and disproves nothing, the grey middle ground where weak cases live and die. You said he argued with his uncle. 2 days before the death, yes. Leonard wanted Hargrove to sell the business and divide the proceeds. Hargrove refused. Leonard admits the argument was heated, but insists it ended without threats. He also insists, with rather too much vehemence, that he loved his uncle and would never harm him. Holmes paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I'd seen before. The look of a man holding 2 incompatible theories in his mind and waiting for the evidence to resolve the contradiction. Here is what troubles me, Watson. Leonard has motive, inheritance, debts, a bitter argument. He has opportunity. His alibi is worthless. And the irregulars have brought me something else. Leonard has been seen over the past several months visiting pawnbrokers on Petticoat Lane with small items, clock parts, accessories, items that could only have come from his uncle's workshop. He has been stealing from Hargrove. In modest quantities, yes. Pieces small enough that an old man with a cluttered workshop might not immediately notice their absence, but pieces that cumulatively represent a pattern of betrayal that would have been devastating to Hargrove had he discovered it, and which gives Leonard a second motive, not merely the inheritance, but the fear of exposure. He opened the door, and the January air rushed in, carrying with it the distant sound of a church bell marking the hour. Lestrade is circling Leonard like a dog that has found a bone and cannot quite believe his luck, and I confess, Watson, that on the surface the bone looks genuine, but surfaces are the particular province of liars, and this case has already shown me one elaborately constructed surface that concealed the truth beneath it. He stepped out into the fog. We have a ghost, Watson, a man who entered Hargrove's workshop and left no trace except 2 initials in a dead man's book. I intend to find him. But first, I must be certain that I am not chasing shadows while a simpler answer stands in plain sight. I followed him into the grey afternoon, and the door of 221B closed behind us with a sound that was swallowed, like everything else that winter, by the fog. Chapter 4. The Nephew's Shadow. The boarding house on Jamaica Road was the kind of establishment that announced its character before one crossed the threshold. The front step had not been swept in recent memory. The brass letter slot was green with neglect, and the curtains in the ground floor window hung with the defeated slump of fabric that has abandoned all pretense of respectability. A hand-lettered card in the window read, "Rooms to let, clean and quiet," and I suspected both adjectives of optimism. Holmes had sent word ahead, and Leonard Hargrove was expecting us, though expecting perhaps overstates the composure with which he received our arrival. He opened the door to his second-floor room with the wary haste of a man who wishes to get an unpleasant interview over with, and who simultaneously fears what the interview might reveal. He was younger than I had imagined from Holmes's description, 34, but with the premature aging that accompanies sustained financial anxiety. His hair was thinning at the temples, his collar had been turned to conceal its fraying edge, and his hands moved with the restless, purposeless energy of a man who cannot decide whether to pour tea or bolt for the stairs. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, please sit down. I apologize for the, well..." He gestured vaguely at the room, which required no elaboration. It was a space of perhaps 12 feet by 10, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, a deal table that served as both desk and dining surface, and 2 chairs whose upholstery had passed through optimism, decline, and resignation to arrive at a state best described as archaeological. The wallpaper was a pattern of brown ferns on a yellow ground that had faded to the colour of old teeth. A single gas jet provided light of the grudging, institutional variety. Holmes took the chair nearest the window, a position that I recognised as strategic, as it placed his back to the light and Leonard's face in full illumination. I took the second chair. Leonard perched on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped between his knees. "Mr. Hargrove," Holmes began, in a tone that was neither accusatory nor sympathetic, but occupied the precise middle ground between the two, the tone of a man collecting facts. "I appreciate your willingness to speak with me again. I shall be direct. You are aware that your uncle's death is now being investigated as a potential crime. Lestrade told me." Leonard's voice was thin and slightly hoarse, as though he had been doing a great deal of talking recently, or none at all. "He seems to believe I had something to do with it. He's been round twice already. The second time he brought a sergeant who looked at me like I was already in the dock. Inspector Lestrade is a methodical man who follows the evidence as he understands it. At present, the evidence presents certain difficulties for you. I am here to determine whether those difficulties are genuine or merely apparent." Leonard stared at him. "You mean you're here to determine whether I killed my uncle?" "I am here to determine the truth, Mr. Hargrove. The two are not always the same thing." There was a silence, during which Leonard seemed to conduct an internal negotiation between candour and self-preservation. Candour won, though narrowly. "I didn't kill him," he said. "I know how it looks. I know about the argument. I know about my debts. I know what Lestrade thinks. But I did not kill my uncle, Mr. Holmes. Whatever else I may have done, whatever mistakes I've made, I did not do that." Holmes let the statement settle in the room like dust. Then he said, quite gently, "Tell me about the argument." Leonard exhaled and pressed his palms flat against his knees, as though steadying himself for a descent. "It was the Monday, 2 days before he died. I went to the shop to return a book I'd borrowed, a technical manual on marine chronometers. Uncle Elias and I. We'd been civil enough for years, but things had been strained since the autumn. My situation," he gestured again at the room, and this time the gesture encompassed not merely the shabby furnishings, but the entirety of his diminished circumstances, "has been worsening. The firm where I work has been reducing hours. My pay has been cut twice since September, and there are debts. The Whitechapel money lender," Holmes said. Leonard flinched as though the words had been a physical blow. "You know about that. I know that you owe a man called Arkwright approximately £40 at an interest rate that would be criminal if the law concerned itself with such transactions among the lower orders. I know that Arkwright employs 2 men whose professional skills run more to persuasion than accountancy, and I know that you have received at least 1 letter threatening consequences if the debt is not addressed by month's end." Leonard's face had gone the colour of the wallpaper. "How?" "The letter was on your mantelpiece during my previous visit. You attempted to conceal it by turning it face down while fetching water, but the paper stock was distinctive. Arkwright uses a particular shade of buff that his clients learn to dread. The content was legible through the paper when held to the light, which I took the liberty of doing while you were in the kitchen." I watched. Leonard absorbed this with the expression of a man who has just realized that the depth of water he is standing in is considerably greater than he estimated. He looked at Holmes, then at me, then at his own hands. £43, he said quietly. £43 and 6 shillings. I borrowed 20 last spring when my landlady threatened eviction. The rest is interest. It compounds monthly. I will never pay it off on a clerk's wages, and Arkwright knows it. He is patient in the way that certain men are patient, because he knows that patience increases the debt, and the debt increases his leverage. And you saw your uncle's shop as a means of resolution. Not the way you make it sound. I didn't want to rob him. I wanted him to sell the business, retire honourably, divide the proceeds. The shop and its contents are worth several £100 at a fair valuation. Uncle Elias could have lived comfortably on his share, and mine would have cleared the debt with enough left to start fresh. I thought it was reasonable. He did not. The argument, he was furious. He said the shop was his life's work, and he would sooner burn it than sell it to a stranger. He said I was a fool and a wastrel for getting into debt in the first place, and that if I expected him to dismantle 30 years of craftsmanship to bail out my stupidity, I profoundly misunderstood both him and the value of what he did. He was... Leonard paused, and for the first time something other than fear moved across his face. It was grief, raw and unguarded, and it aged him 10 years in the space of a breath. He was right, Mr. Holmes, about all of it. He was a difficult man, my uncle, but he was right about the shop and right about me, and I left that afternoon feeling 2 inches tall and deserving of every one of those inches. Holmes said nothing for a moment. He was watching Leonard with the focused, unblinking attention that I had seen him direct at crime scenes, documents, and the faces of liars. But there was something else in his expression, something closer to calibration than judgment, as though he were measuring the weight of Leonard's words against some internal standard of sincerity. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "I must ask you about another matter, and I advise you to answer with complete honesty, as I already possess the relevant facts, and will know immediately if you do not. Over the past 6 months, you have been visiting pawnbrokers on Petticoat Lane with items taken from your uncle's workshop. Small pieces, clock parts, brass fittings, decorative accessories, items whose absence might go unnoticed in a shop as crowded as Hargrove's. What do you say to this?" The colour that had drained from Leonard's face did not return. If anything, he grew paler, a trick I would not have thought physiologically possible given his already cadaverous complexion. He opened his mouth, closed it, and for a terrible moment I thought he might be sick. Then he put his face in his hands and spoke through his fingers. "Yes." "How many items?" "I don't know exactly. Perhaps 15, 20. Small things. Replacement bezels, a few winding keys, a set of enamel watch faces that were sitting in a drawer unused. Nothing of great individual value, a few shillings each. I told myself it didn't matter, that he had so much he wouldn't notice, that it was practically an advance on my inheritance, that I would replace them when my situation improved." He raised his face and his eyes were red. "I am not proud of it, Mr. Holmes. I am, in fact, thoroughly ashamed. But stealing a handful of watch faces is a very long way from murder." "It is," Holmes agreed, "but it provides a second motive that Inspector Lestrade would find compelling. If your uncle had discovered the thefts—" "He hadn't. I'm certain of it. He would have confronted me directly. My uncle was not a man who suffered in silence when he felt wronged. If he had known, I would have heard about it in terms that left no room for ambiguity. And yet the possibility that he might discover them, that each visit to the shop carried the risk of exposure, must have weighed upon you." "It did. Constantly. Every time I saw him, I expected him to say something. Every time he looked at me with that sharp watchmaker's eye, I thought he could see straight through me. But he never said a word." Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, where the thin light of the January afternoon filtered through glass that had not been cleaned since the previous administration. He stood there for a moment, his profile sharp against the grey sky, and I could see the machinery of his mind working behind his eyes. "Your alibi for the evening of the 15th, Mr. Hargrove. You told Inspector Lestrade you were at a public house in Bermondsey from 6 o'clock. "The Waterman's Arms on Tooley Street. I went there after work. I had 2 pints of bitter and left, sometime around 9. "The barman's recollection is imprecise. "I know. I'm not a regular. I go perhaps once a fortnight. He knows my face, but not my name, and the place was busy that evening. I cannot force the man to remember what he did not observe." "And before 6 o'clock, your working hours end at—" "4:30. I walked from the firm's offices on Hayes Wharf to the public house. It's a 20-minute walk, perhaps 25. I arrived at— well, I thought it was 5:45, but I cannot prove it. So, between 4:30 and approximately 5:45, you were walking through Bermondsey alone with no one to corroborate your movements. Yes. Leonard met Holmes's gaze with the defiant weariness of a man who understands exactly how damning this sounds and has no remedy for it. I was walking. I often walk when I'm troubled. It clears my head, or at least it prevents my head from becoming more cluttered than it already is. I did not walk to Clerkenwell. I did not visit my uncle. I did not kill him. Holmes turned from the window. One more question, Mr. Hargrove. Were you aware that your uncle had recently taken out a substantial insurance policy on the workshop's contents? Leonard blinked. Insurance? No. Uncle Elias was not a man who trusted insurance companies. He used to say they were bookmakers in better suits. The policy names his apprentice, Samuel Finch, as partial beneficiary. Something shifted behind Leonard's eyes. Not guilt, not surprise, but a flicker of wounded recognition, as though a suspicion he had long held about his own standing in his uncle's affections had been quietly confirmed. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Finch. Of course. The boy could do no wrong in my uncle's eyes. Finch was the son he wished he'd had, careful, devoted, gifted with his hands. I was merely the nephew who turned out to be a disappointment. I cannot say I blame him for the preference. I have given him very little reason to feel otherwise. We left Leonard Hargrove sitting on the edge of his bed in that dismal room, his hands hanging between his knees, and his gaze fixed on the floor with the expression of a man who has run out of both resources and pretenses. As we descended the narrow staircase, Holmes was silent until we reached the street, where the fog wrapped around us like a damp conspirator. Well, Watson? I think he is telling the truth, I said. About the murder, at least. The thefts, the debts, the argument. Those are the confessions of a desperate man, not a calculating one. He hasn't the composure for murder. Composure can be manufactured, but I am inclined to agree with your instinct, if not your reasoning. Leonard Hargrove is a weak man, a foolish man, and quite probably a cowardly man, but the crime in that workshop was committed by someone with a particular quality that Leonard conspicuously lacks. Which quality? Presence of mind. The killer staged a scene under pressure in a dead man's workshop with the clock ticking, if you will forgive the expression. He moved the body, climbed a ladder, arranged the debris, wiped the evidence, pocketed the watch, locked the door, and walked calmly to Blackfriars Bridge to dispose of the key. That is not the behaviour of a man who falls apart under questioning in his own bedroom. That is the behaviour of a man accustomed to constructing false realities, a man for whom deception is not a desperate measure, but a practised skill. He raised his hand for a cab, and the fog swallowed his gesture before a driver could see it. Possibly, he added, lowering his arm and resigning himself to walking. But guilt and evidence are different mechanisms, Watson. One turns with motive, the other with fact. We have a surplus of the former and a deficit of the latter. Until the deficit is corrected, Leonard remains on the board. We walked in silence through the damp streets of Bermondsey, and I reflected that Holmes's metaphor was, perhaps inadvertently, as precise as anything in the case itself. Mechanisms, gears and springs, a crime assembled from moving parts, each one concealed inside the next, and somewhere at the centre, the mainspring that drove the whole apparatus, a man with the initials PT, who had entered a clockmaker's workshop and set in motion a chain of consequences that was still, even now, unwinding. Chapter 5. The Apprentice's Burden. Holmes did not speak of the case again that evening. He retreated into one of his characteristic silences, not the restless, agitated silence of a man without occupation, but the deep, almost meditative stillness of a mind engaged in subterranean labour. He sat in his armchair with his pipe until the fire burned to embers, his eyes open but focused on nothing in the room, and when I rose to retire for the night, he acknowledged my departure with a slight inclination of his head that might have been a good night or might have been an involuntary twitch. With Holmes, the distinction was not always clear. I found him in the same chair the next morning, though he had changed his pipe, and the ashtray suggested he had smoked through most of the night. He was dressed, however, a promising sign, and when I entered, he rose with the sudden energy of a man who has completed his deliberations and is impatient to test their conclusions against the world. "Watson, we are going to Clerkenwell. I wish to speak with Samuel Finch, and I wish to do so in the workshop, where the young man's hands will tell me more than his words." His hands? A craftsman's hands are his autobiography, Watson. Every callus is a chapter. I read an interesting passage during our first visit, and I should like to examine the full text. We arrived at the workshop shortly after 9 o'clock. The fog had thinned overnight to a sullen haze that permitted grudging visibility, and Clerkenwell Close had resumed its quiet. Commerce, the tapping of hammers from a silversmith's shop, the measured ticking that seemed to emanate from the very brickwork of the lane, and the occasional passage of a delivery cart, whose wheels rang on the cobblestones with a sound like dull bells. Finch opened the door before we knocked. He had been watching for us from the window, and his face bore the anxious expectancy of a young man who has placed his faith in a stranger's competence, and is not yet certain whether the investment was wise. He wore his working apron, Hargrove's apron I noted, which was too broad for his narrower frame and hung on him like a vestment inherited from a larger priest. The workshop was unchanged from our previous visit, save that the chalk outline had been partially scuffed by foot traffic, and several of the clocks on the walls had wound down to silence. Not all of them, however. As we entered, I became aware of a layered, syncopated ticking from perhaps a dozen mechanisms still running, a sound that was at once mechanical and oddly organic, as though the room itself had a pulse. "You have been winding them," Holmes observed, not as a question. Finch coloured slightly. "Not all of them. Only the ones Master Hargrove would have wound himself. He had a schedule, certain clocks on certain days. I've been keeping to it. I know it seems foolish, but—" "It does not seem foolish, Mr. Finch. It seems faithful. There is a difference that most people are too careless to observe." Holmes removed his coat and hung it on the hook beside the door with the ease of a man making himself at home in a space he intended to study at length. "Now, I should like you to show me your hands," Finch blinked. "My hands?" "Palms up, if you please. Both of them." The young man extended his hands with the self-consciousness of a schoolboy submitting to inspection. Holmes took them in his own, a gesture that was clinical rather than intimate, and turned them slowly under the light of the workshop's gas lamps. He examined the fingers individually, pressing the pads of the thumbs, running his own fingertip across the ridges of callus that marked each digit. "You are right-handed," Holmes said. "Your primary work calluses are on the right thumb and the first two fingers, consistent with years of gripping fine tools, tweezers, and pin vices. The left hand shows the flatter, broader calluses of a man who holds and steadies while the right hand operates. This is standard for a clockmaker of your experience, but there is something additional." He raised Finch's right hand higher and angled it toward the lamp. "Here, on the outer edge of the right thumb and the inner edge of the right forefinger, there is a secondary callus pattern, newer, less established, overlaying the primary pattern. This is not the mark of standard clock repair. This is the mark of a man who has been working with a tourbillon cage. Specifically, the repetitive micro-adjustment of a tourbillon bridge, which requires a particular lateral pressure between thumb and forefinger that no other operation in horology demands." Finch stared at Holmes with the expression of a man who has just watched a conjurer produce a live bird from an empty hat. "How could you possibly—" "The callus does not lie, Mr. Finch. You have been secretly practicing the repair of a breguet tourbillon, a movement far beyond the standard apprentice curriculum, one of the most demanding mechanisms in all of horology. You have been doing this on your own time without your master's knowledge, because you wish to prove yourself capable of work that he had not yet entrusted to you. Am I correct? Finch withdrew his hand slowly, as though recovering a private document that had been read aloud without permission. The colour in his face deepened from embarrassment to something more complex. Pride, perhaps, or the painful vulnerability of a secret ambition exposed. "There is a breguet in the shop," he said quietly. "A subscription watch, circa 1805. It came in for repair 8 months ago, and Master Hargrove declared it beyond our current capacity. He said it needed to go to a specialist in Geneva, but I studied it before he sent it out. I made drawings. I obtained a damaged tourbillon movement from a dealer on Hatton Garden, and I've been practicing in the evenings after the shop closes. I wanted—" He stopped, and the grief that had been held in careful suspension since our arrival surfaced for a moment in his eyes. "I wanted to show him that I could do it, that I was ready for the work he loved most. I never got the chance." Holmes regarded the young man with an expression I'd rarely seen him direct at anyone, a look of unguarded respect, tempered by the awareness that respect, in the context of a murder investigation, was a luxury that could not be afforded without scrutiny. "Mr. Finch," he said, and his tone shifted with the precision of a man, changing keys. "I must now raise a matter that will cause you discomfort, and I ask that you receive it with the same honesty you have shown thus far. Inspector Lestrade has discovered that your master recently took out a substantial insurance policy on the contents of this workshop. You are named as partial beneficiary." The transformation in Finch was immediate and violent. The blood drained from his face, as though a tap had been opened somewhere beneath his collar, and he took a half-step backward that struck his hip against the workbench. "That is not—" "I did not!" He stopped, gathered himself with visible effort, and spoke with the careful deliberation of a man choosing each word as though it were a component in a mechanism that must not jam. "I knew that Master Hargrove had insured the workshop. He told me so last autumn. He said the collection had grown too valuable to leave unprotected. But he did not tell me the terms of the policy, and I certainly did not know that I was named as a beneficiary. Mr. Holmes, I swear to you—" "I'm not asking you to swear, Mr. Finch. I'm asking you to explain. Why would a master clockmaker name his apprentice rather than his own family as the beneficiary of an insurance policy?" Finch stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed to the workbench and placed both hands flat upon its surface, as though drawing stability from the same oak that had supported his master's work for 3 decades. "Because he thought of me as his son," he said. He never said it in those words. Master Hargrove was not a man who spoke easily about such things. But I came to him when I was 16, fresh from a charity school, with nothing but a pair of hands that could hold steady and an eye that could see small. He taught me everything, not just the craft, the patience, the discipline, the reverence for the work itself. When other masters paid their apprentices a pittance and worked them like draft horses, he fed me at his own table and gave me a room above the shop and treated my education as though it were the most important commission he had ever undertaken. And his family? His nephew, Leonard? Leonard! Finch spoke the name with a controlled neutrality that suggested considerable feeling held firmly in check. Leonard visited when he wanted something. He had no interest in the work, no understanding of its value, and no patience for the old man's devotion to it. I do not say this to disparage him. I say it because it is true, and Master Hargrove knew it, and it grieved him. And Margaret, Hargrove's daughter? At the mention of this name, a different reaction entirely crossed Finch's features. Not the defensive pallor of a man accused, but the involuntary softening of a man caught off guard by the mention of someone he cares for deeply. He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. Holmes, I could see, had registered the change with the precision of a seismograph detecting a distant tremor. "You know Margaret Hargrove," Holmes said. It was not a question. Finch closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." "You have been meeting with her?" "Yes." "Secretly?" "Yes." He opened his eyes and faced Holmes with the exhausted resolve of a man who has decided that the truth, however costly, is less exhausting than its concealment. Margaret left home 3 years ago after a quarrel with her father. He wanted her to marry a man she did not love, the son of a fellow craftsman, a match that Master Hargrove considered ideal for the continuation of the trade. Margaret refused. The argument was terrible. She left, took a position as a governess in Kensington, and they did not speak again. But you maintained contact with her. She wrote to me 6 months after she left, a letter addressed to the workshop, asking after her father's health. I replied. We began to correspond and eventually to meet. She is... He paused, and the effort of restraint was visible in the set of his jaw. She is a remarkable woman, Mr. Holmes, and I have been trying, for the better part of a year, to broker a reconciliation between her and her father. I arranged for her letters to reach him through indirect channels. I mentioned her name in conversation when I thought his mood was receptive. I was making progress, or I believed I was. He had begun to ask about her in the way that proud men ask about the people they miss, disguising curiosity as indifference. And you concealed this from Inspector Lestrade, because I knew how it would look. The apprentice named in the insurance policy, conducting a secret relationship with the estranged daughter. Lestrade would see manipulation where there was only love. He would see a conspiracy where there was only 2 people trying to mend what a stubborn old man had broken. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Finch with an intensity that seemed to weigh not merely the young man's words, but the architecture of his character, the foundations, the load-bearing walls, the hidden rooms. "Mr. Finch," he said at last, "there is a particular kind of man who keeps another man's clocks running after he is dead." He paused, and his eyes moved to the workshop walls, where the surviving mechanisms ticked on in their faithful, uncomprehending rhythm. "He is either devoted or very good at pretending." He did not say which he believed Finch to be. He took his coat from the hook, nodded once to the young man, and walked out into Clerkenwell Close without another word. I followed, as I always did, into the grey air and the sound of ticking that seemed to follow us down the lane like the heartbeat of a place that did not yet know it was dying. "Holmes," I said, when we had walked some distance in silence, "do you believe him?" "I believe that he loves Margaret Hargrove." That much was written across his face in a script that even Lestrade could read. Whether love precludes guilt is a question that the criminal courts have been debating since their inception, and I do not propose to settle it on a Wednesday morning in Clerkenwell. He hailed a cab with a sharp gesture that parted the fog like a command. "But I will tell you this, Watson. The insurance policy is a complication, not a clue. Hargrove insured his workshop because its contents were genuinely valuable, and he named Finch because Finch was genuinely loved. The suspicious appearance of the arrangement is a function of Lestrade's imagination, not of Finch's guilt." "Then Leonard remains your primary suspect." "Leonard remains everyone's primary suspect, which is precisely why I distrust the conclusion. When the evidence arranges itself too neatly around a single figure, I begin to suspect the arrangement rather than the figure." He climbed into the cab and settled against the seat with the distant expression of a man whose thoughts were already elsewhere. "Tomorrow, Watson, we visit a German clockmaker, with a grudge and an inadequate alibi. The field, I fear, is about to become more crowded before it narrows." The cab rattled away from Clerkenwell, and behind us, in the workshop of a dead man, a young man's hands resumed the work of keeping time alive. Chapter 6. The Rival on Clerkenwell. Close Heinrich Voigt's workshop on Hatton Garden occupied the ground floor of a narrow building, wedged between a diamond merchant and a firm of solicitors whose brass nameplate had been polished to a state of aggressive respectability. The workshop itself presented a curious contrast to its neighbours, where they proclaimed themselves with gilt lettering and immaculate facades. Voigt's establishment announced its presence through a single wooden sign, hand-carved in a Germanic black-letter script that might have been transplanted from a Nuremberg side street, reading simply, Voigt, Irmischer, Est, 1871. Holmes studied the sign for a moment before entering. A man who advertises in German on an English street is making a statement about where his loyalties lie, he murmured, or rather, where he wishes them to be perceived to lie. Let us see whether his candour extends beyond his signage. We entered without knocking, a liberty Holmes took with the confidence of a man who understood that unexpected arrivals produced more honest reactions than scheduled ones. The interior was, in its way, as revealing as Leonard Hargrove's dismal boarding-house had been, though the story it told was entirely different. Where Hargrove's workshop had been a warm, cluttered sanctuary of accumulated decades, Voigt's was a temple of order. Every tool hung in its appointed place, on a pegboard arranged with military precision. The workbenches, there were two, positioned at right angles, were bare save for the single project currently underway on each. The shelves held components in labelled drawers, each drawer fronted with a handwritten card in Voigt's meticulous copper plate. Even the light was disciplined, two adjustable lamps positioned to eliminate shadow from the work surfaces, their brass arms polished to a shine that suggested daily attention. Voigt himself was seated at the nearer bench, a jeweller's loop clamped to his right eye, his fingers engaged in the delicate operation of adjusting something inside a carriage clock's movement. He was a compact man of 56, with close-cropped grey hair, a trimmed beard that followed the line of his jaw with geometric precision, and the sort of posture that suggested a youth spent in an environment where slouching carried consequences. He did not look up when we entered. He completed whatever micro-adjustment he was performing, set down his tools with the careful deliberation of a surgeon concluding a procedure, and only then raised his eyes. "Mr. Holmes," he said. His English was excellent, lightly accented, with the clipped vowels of a man who had learned the language from textbooks, before he learned it from conversation. "I have been expecting someone. I did not expect it to be you." "You anticipated a visit from the police?" "I anticipated a visit from someone who wished to ask me whether I killed Elias Hargrove. The answer is no. But I suspect you have come for more than a simple denial." He removed the loop from his eye and set it beside his tools, with the same measured precision. "Please, sit. I will not offer you tea, as I do not keep tea in the workshop. It produces condensation, and condensation is the enemy of fine metal work." Holmes smiled, a thin, appreciative smile that he reserved for individuals who met his expectations of intelligence, regardless of whether he liked them. We sat on a pair of oak stools that Voigt indicated, and Holmes wasted no time on preamble. "Mr. Voigt, you were seen on Clerkenwell Close on the afternoon of January the 15th, the day of Hargrove's death. You told Inspector Lestrade that you were there to deliver a repaired barometer to a shop on the Close. Is that correct?" "It is. Anson's, the instrument dealer, 3 doors down from Hargrove. I had repaired a mercury barometer for them. A simple commission, but Anson is a reliable client, and I deliver personally." "Anson's closes at 3 o'clock. "It does. I made my delivery at approximately 1:45. The work was received, payment was made, and I departed." "And yet you were seen in the area as late as 2:30. What detained you?" Voigt's jaw tightened fractionally, the involuntary contraction of a man whose composure is being tested in a way he finds disagreeable. I walked. Clerkenwell Close was the heart of the horological trade in London. I have colleagues there, or had. I stopped at Burden's window to examine a regulator clock he had on display. I exchanged a few words with the engraver at number 14 about a commission I was considering. These are not remarkable activities for a clockmaker on a street of clockmakers. And you did not visit Hargrove's workshop. I did not. I had no reason to visit Elias Hargrove and no desire to do so. Our relationship, Mr. Holmes, was not one that encouraged social calls. Tell me about that relationship. Voigt's expression underwent a subtle transformation, not softening exactly, but deepening, as though a layer of professional reserve were being peeled back to reveal something raw beneath. He folded his hands on the bench and spoke with the controlled precision of a man who has rehearsed an account many times in his own mind, but has never spoken it aloud. Elias Hargrove was a gifted craftsman. I do not deny this. His hands were among the finest I have encountered in 40 years of the trade. But he was also a vain man, vain in the particular way of English craftsmen who believe that excellence in one domain confers authority in all others. He collected admirers the way other men collect stamps, and he treated disagreement as a personal affront. The escapement dispute. Voigt's hands tightened on each other. The escapement. Yes. 3 years ago, I presented a paper to the Horological Society describing a modified detent escapement of my own design, a variation that improved isochronism at the cost of a marginal increase in friction. It was, I believed, an original contribution. Hargrove attended the lecture. During the discussion period, he rose and declared, publicly in front of the full membership, that my design was not original, but was derived from a 17th century Dutch modification by Salomon Costa, which he then described in detail from memory. Was he correct? The question hung in the workshop air like a pendulum at the top of its arc. Voigt held Holmes's gaze with the rigid dignity of a man for whom the answer cost something. He was partially correct. The resemblance to Costa's work was genuine. I had studied Costa, as any serious horologist must, and the influence was present in my design. But influence is not theft, Mr. Holmes. Every mechanism in the history of horology builds upon what came before. Hargrove did not merely point out a resemblance. He accused me before my peers of passing off another man's work as my own. He used the word copied. My reputation has not recovered. And this made you his enemy. This made us adversaries. There is a difference, though. I concede the distinction may be too fine for a criminal investigation. I resented Hargrove. I believed he acted out of vanity rather than honest scholarship, that he humiliated me not because truth demanded it, but because the audience demanded a performance. But resentment is not violence, Mr. Holmes. I am a man who expresses his grievances through precision, not through force. Holmes nodded slowly, as though filing this self-assessment for later evaluation. Then he changed direction with the abruptness of a man turning a corner. Mr. Voigt, I wish to ask you about a pocket watch, specifically an automaton watch attributed to Jacques de Vaucanson, believed to have been in Elias Hargrove's possession. The shift in Voigt's demeanour was immediate and involuntary. His hands, which had been folded with deliberate calm, separated and moved to the bench surface, where his fingers pressed flat against the wood as though anchoring himself. It was a small movement, but Holmes observed it with the focused attention of a man watching a barometer fall. I know of the watch, Voigt said carefully. Every serious horologist in London knew of it. Hargrove had been showing it selectively, a privilege extended only to those he wished to impress or to torment, depending on his mood. You wished to acquire it? Voigt was silent for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality I had not heard in it before. Something that was neither anger nor defensiveness, but closer to the particular anguish of a man whose deepest professional passion has been caught in the light. I wish to study it. The Vaucanson watch, if it is genuine, and I believe it is, represents the pinnacle of 18th century miniature automata. The mechanism by which the songbird is animated within such a confined space is, to my knowledge, undocumented. No technical drawings survive. The watch is not merely valuable, Mr. Holmes. It is irreplaceable. It is a question that only examination can answer, and Hargrove was keeping the question locked in his workshop like a miser hoarding gold. You made him an offer. Through an intermediary, a Viennese collector named Grunbaum, with whom I have corresponded for many years. I proposed a formal loan arrangement, the watch to be examined under controlled conditions in my workshop, fully insured, for a period of 2 weeks, in exchange for a fee of £50. It was a generous offer. Hargrove rejected it with language that I shall not repeat in the presence of your colleague. And subsequent to this rejection, you continued to correspond with Herr Grunbaum about the watch. Voigt's jaw worked for a moment. I did. Grunbaum and I discussed the theoretical mechanisms involved. It was an academic correspondence. We were attempting to deduce the construction from external descriptions and from what is known of Vaucanson's other work. I was not plotting to steal the watch, Mr. Holmes, if that is your implication. I am not a thief. I am an engineer. Holmes rose from his stool and moved to the second workbench, where a partially disassembled marine chronometer lay in its case, its components arranged in a semicircle with the orderliness of surgical instruments. He examined it for a moment without touching anything, then turned back to Voigt. Mr. Voigt, I believe you. Not because your character compels belief. I have been deceived by men of far greater apparent integrity, but because the evidence supports your account. The shop on a Clerkenwell close where you delivered the barometer, Anson's, was indeed closed when I visited yesterday, but the proprietor's son was present, cataloguing stock. He confirmed your delivery and stated that you departed the premises at approximately 1:45. He further stated that he saw you pass the shop window heading toward Hatton Garden at approximately 3:15. The murder occurred no earlier than 4:15. You were gone from the area for at least 90 minutes before the crime. Something eased in Voigt's posture, not dramatically, for he was not a man who permitted himself dramatic shifts, but perceptibly. The rigid line of his shoulders softened by a degree, and his hands relaxed against the bench. Then I am cleared. Of the murder, yes. Of the charge of professional jealousy and excessive interest in another man's property, you must answer to your own conscience. But I did not come here only to clear you, Mr. Voigt. I came because you are one of a very small number of people in London with the expertise to evaluate the Vaucanson watch and the connections to facilitate its sale on the continental market. If someone wished to sell that watch, quickly, discreetly, and at a price commensurate with its rarity, how would they proceed? Voigt considered the question with the thoroughness of a man for whom intellectual problems, regardless of their context, demanded rigorous analysis. The watch cannot be sold openly. It is too well known within the horological community. Any public auction or dealer sale would immediately raise questions about provenance. The buyer would need to be a private collector with the means to purchase and the discretion to conceal. There are perhaps a dozen such individuals in Europe. The seller would need an intermediary, someone trusted by the collecting community, someone who could authenticate the piece and facilitate the transaction without official scrutiny. Names, Mr. Voigt. For the intermediaries, there are 3 credible options in London. Alderton, the Bond Street dealer. He has handled private sales of this calibre before. Myself, though I trust you appreciate the irony, and a man named Percival Thorne, who operates in the grey space between collecting and dealing. Thorne has connections to private buyers in Amsterdam, Geneva, and Vienna. He is... Voigt paused, selecting his words with the care of a man inserting a jewel into a setting. He is the sort of man who knows the price of everything and attends the finest parties, and yet one never quite sees where the money comes from. Holmes's expression did not change, but I had known him long enough to recognize the almost imperceptible stillness that came over him when a line of inquiry struck its target. It was the stillness of a pointer that has found the scent, a complete cessation of extraneous movement that concentrated all energy into the single faculty of attention. "Percival Thorne," he repeated quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Voigt. You have been more helpful than you know." We left the workshop and stepped into the bustle of Hatton Garden, where the diamond merchants and solicitors went about their business in the pale winter light, with the blithe indifference of people for whom another man's tragedy is merely the morning's conversation. "Watson," Holmes said as we walked toward Holborn, "I want you to make an inquiry this afternoon. There is a chestnut vendor who keeps a stall at the eastern end of Blackfriars Bridge. Lestrade's report mentions him in passing, a man who noticed a gentleman pausing at the bridge railing on the evening of the 15th. Lestrade did not pursue the matter because Lestrade was not, at that stage, looking for a gentleman on a bridge. I would like you to find this vendor and ask him what he saw." I found the man at 3:30, a weathered fellow of indeterminate age wrapped in a coat that appeared to be composed of several older coats stitched together in a spirit of desperate collaboration. His stall was a converted barrow positioned at the bridge's eastern approach, and his chestnuts, I must say, were excellent. He remembered the evening clearly. It had been cold, and the bridge was quiet. A gentleman had walked from the north bank at what he estimated was 5:10, moving at a brisk pace. The gentleman had paused at the railing midway across the bridge, and stood there for a moment, not leaning, not contemplating the view, but doing something with his hands at the rail. The vendor had the impression that the gentleman had dropped something into the river, though he could not be certain. "What did he look like?" I asked. "Quality," the vendor said, in the comprehensive shorthand of a man who assessed his fellow Londoners primarily by the likelihood of their purchasing chestnuts. "Tall, dark coat, good cloth, top hat, carried a stick with a bright head on it. Silver, it looked like, caught the lamplight, walked like he owned the pavement, didn't buy any chestnuts." I reported this to Holmes that evening. He listened with his eyes closed, his fingers moving in a slow, rhythmic pattern against the arm of his chair, as though he were tapping out a code that only he could read. Dark overcoat, top hat, silver-headed cane, walking briskly from the direction of Clerkenwell toward the south bank at 5:10. He opened his eyes. Mrs. Doyle's gentleman, the chestnut vendor's gentleman, the same man, Watson. He entered Hargrove's workshop at 4:15, departed before 5:15, walked to Blackfriars Bridge, disposed of the key in the Thames at 5:10, and continued south. The route is coherent, the timeline is consistent. He rose and stood at the window, gazing out at the bridge of fog-blurred lamplight that was Baker Street at night. "The Thames keeps more secrets than any man in London, Watson, and someone recently asked it to keep one more." Chapter 7. The Viennese Connection. The following morning brought a telegram that altered the trajectory of the investigation. It arrived at 7:30, delivered by a boy whose knock carried the particular urgency of a messenger, who has been tipped 6pence to run rather than walk. Holmes, who had been standing at the mantelpiece in his dressing gown, studying the network of notes and connections he had pinned to the wall over the course of the week, tore the envelope open with a single motion and read the contents in silence. Then he read them again. Then he set the telegram on the breakfast table beside my untouched eggs and said, "The field narrows, Watson." I picked up the telegram. It was from a name I did not recognize, Daubigny with a Paris address, and its contents were brief. Vaucanson watch known to 3 continental collectors. Stop Grunbaum Vienna declined. Recent purchase offer. Stopwatch offered Amsterdam through. London intermediary. Stop name unknown. Stop inquiry continues. Stop D'Aubigny. D'Aubigny is an associate of mine in the French antiquities trade, Holmes explained, pouring himself coffee with the distracted efficiency of a man whose mind was already 3 moves ahead of his hands. I wired him 2 days ago requesting information on any recent movement of the Vaucanson watch through continental markets. The response confirms what I suspected. The watch has surfaced, and it has surfaced quickly. Whoever took it is not collecting it. He is selling it, and he is doing so through London channels, which means the intermediary is someone embedded in the English antiquities community. Voigt mentioned 3 names: himself, a Bond Street dealer called Alderton, and Percival Thorne. He did, and I have spent the past 48 hours reducing that list. Holmes carried his coffee to the armchair and settled into it, with the coiled energy of a man who was sitting down only because the next stage of the hunt required thought rather than movement. Alderton, the Bond Street dealer, has been in Paris since the 28th of December. I confirmed this yesterday through his shop assistant, who showed me a postcard from Alderton complaining about French coffee. He did not return to London until the 19th of January, 4 days after the murder. He cannot have served as the intermediary for a sale initiated on, or shortly after the 15th. Which leaves Thorne. But I am not yet ready to confront a man on the basis of subtraction. I want to understand who Percival Thorne is before I place him under examination. A man's history is the lens through which his present actions become legible. He set down his coffee and reached for his coat. I am going to the British Museum. There is a curator in the horology collection, a man named Whitfield, who has forgotten more about automata than most men will ever learn. I want to understand the Vaucanson watch not merely as a motive, but as an object. What it is, what it means, and what it would be worth to a man with the right buyer. He paused at the door. You, Watson, have a different assignment. I want you to visit the Horological Society's reading room on Northampton Square. The Society keeps records of its public lectures, demonstrations, and dinners. Percival Thorne is not a member. I have checked, but he may have attended events as a guest. If he has moved in horological circles, there will be traces. Look for his name in guest registers, auction catalogues, and the Society's quarterly bulletin. I want to know how long this man has been orbiting the world of rare timepieces, and who has been foolish enough to invite him in. We parted at the door of 221B, and I made my way to Northampton Square through a morning that had, for the first time in days, achieved something approaching clarity. The fog had retreated to a thin gauze that softened the edges of buildings without obscuring them, and the winter sun, pale, non-committal, but undeniably present, cast long shadows across the pavements. London, it seemed, was beginning to remember that it existed in 3 dimensions. The Horological Society's premises occupied a handsome Georgian building whose interior combined the hush of a library with the faint, pervasive ticking of demonstration pieces displayed in glass cases along the corridors. A clerk of advanced years and meticulous courtesy directed me to the reading room, where the Society's records were maintained in bound volumes arranged by year and category. I spent the better part of 3 hours in that quiet room, turning pages with the methodical patience that Holmes's investigations had taught me to cultivate. The records were extensive: minutes of meetings, programmes for lectures, guest lists for annual dinners, catalogues from exhibitions, and the quarterly bulletin in which members reported on acquisitions, restorations, and points of scholarly interest. The name Percival Thorne appeared 4 times. The first occurrence was in the guest register for the Society's annual dinner of 1892, where Thorn was listed as the guest of a member named Alderton, the same Bond Street dealer who was now in Paris. The second was in the 1893 dinner register, this time as the guest of a different member, a collector named Hartwell. The third was a mention in the Quarterly Bulletin of spring 1894, in which a contributor noted that Mr. P. Thorn, the well-known collector, displayed a fine example of a Tompion repeating watch at the March exhibition. The fourth, and most recent, was in the guest register for a private lecture in November 1894, just 2 months before the murder, on the subject of 18th century automata. The lecturer was the British Museum's own Whitfield, and Thorn had attended as the guest of a member whose name stopped my hand mid-page, Elias Hargrove. Hargrove had invited Thorn to a lecture on automata, 2 months before his death. 2 months before the Vaucanson watch was stolen from his workbench. I copied the relevant entries into my notebook and left Northampton Square with the peculiar sensation of carrying a lit match through a room full of kindling. When I reached Baker Street, Holmes was already there, seated at the dining table amid a fresh constellation of papers and telegrams, his expression carrying the cold, bright focus of a man whose separate lines of inquiry were converging toward a single point. "Watson, what did you find?" I laid my notes before him. He read them in silence, his eyes moving rapidly across the page. When he reached the November entry, Hargrove as Thorn's host, his finger stopped and pressed against the paper, as though pinning a specimen to a board. "Hargrove invited him," he said quietly. "The old clockmaker invited the man who would kill him to a lecture on the very subject that would provide the motive." Thorn sat in that lecture room and heard Whitfield describe the Vaucanson automata, and then he went home with Hargrove's trust in his pocket like a stolen coin. He looked up. "It is almost unbearably elegant in its cruelty." Thorn used Hargrove's own generosity as his point of entry. "What did you learn from Whitfield?" Holmes pushed back from the table and rose to pace, the four-stride circuit that I knew as well as my own pulse. Whitfield confirmed the watch's extraordinary rarity and value. He estimates that the Vaucanson automaton watch, if authenticated, would command between £1,500 and £2,000 from the right private collector, a sum that places it among the most valuable horological objects in private hands. He also confirmed that the watch had been discussed in collecting circles for several years, that Hargrove had shown it selectively to trusted acquaintances, and that at least 2 continental collectors had expressed interest in acquiring it. The Amsterdam buyer from Daubigny's telegram? Almost certainly. Whitfield gave me a name, Van der Hoorn, an Amsterdam industrialist with a passion for mechanical curiosities. Van der Hoorn has the means, the appetite, and the discretion to purchase such a piece without asking inconvenient questions about provenance. If someone wished to convert the Vaucanson watch into money quickly and quietly, Van der Hoorn would be the ideal buyer. He stopped pacing and stood before the wall of notes, his back to me, his hands clasped behind him in the posture that I had come to associate with the final assembly of a complex deduction. "Now, what do we know about Percival Thorn? He is a gentleman collector, or presents himself as one. He has moved in horological circles for at least 3 years, always as a guest, never as a member. He has displayed objects at society exhibitions, suggesting he possesses, or possesses access to, genuine pieces of quality. He was known to Hargrove well enough to receive an invitation to a private lecture, and his initials match the entry in Hargrove's appointment book on the day of the murder." He turned to face me. "But there is more. I have spent the afternoon making inquiries through channels that Lestrade does not possess and would not approve of. My network of informants in the antiquities trade, the dealers, the runners, the men who operate in the spaces between legitimate commerce and outright theft, have provided me with a portrait of Percival Thorn that differs markedly from his public presentation." He returned to the table and spread several sheets of paper before me. They were covered in his angular handwriting, notes from conversations, I gathered, rather than documents. Thorn claims to be the scion of a Gloucestershire family with a country estate and independent means. In fact, the estate, Thorn Park, near Cheltenham, was repossessed by creditors 2 years ago. The family, money, such as it was, evaporated in the late 1880s through a combination of poor investments and what my informant delicately termed lifestyle expenditures. Thorn has been living on appearances ever since, rented rooms in Mayfair, membership at a middling club on Pall Mall, and a wardrobe maintained with the desperate care of a man for whom clothing is a professional tool rather than a personal indulgence. A confidence man. A confidence man of the most refined variety, the sort who does not steal from strangers in the street, but from acquaintances in the drawing room. My informants associate him with a string of small but significant disappearances from private collections over the past several years. A Fabergé snuff box that vanished after a dinner party in Belgravia. A pair of Georgian silver candlesticks missing from a country house where Thorn was a weekend guest. A first edition Audubon plate that evaporated from a collector's library after Thorn visited to admire it. None of these thefts were ever formally reported. The victims, being members of Thorn's social circle, preferred embarrassment to scandal. And his debts? Considerable. He owes money to a gambling syndicate operated by a man known in certain circles as Mr. Cray, a figure of sufficient menace that his debtors tend to settle promptly or suffer consequences that discourage further delinquency. Thorn's debt to Cray is, by my informant's estimate, approximately £2,000. The deadline for repayment is the end of this month. I sat back in my chair. The pieces were arranging themselves with the inexorable precision of a clockwork mechanism, each gear engaging the next, each movement driving the whole assembly toward a conclusion that felt less like discovery than like the completion of a design that had existed all along. £2,000, I said, the value of the Vaucanson watch. Precisely. Thorn did not visit Hargrove's workshop to have a carriage clock appraised. He visited to steal the one object that could save his life. The appraisal was a pretext, a reason to be in the workshop near the workbench within arm's reach of salvation. He did not intend to kill, but when Hargrove caught him in the act and the old man's grip closed around his wrist, Thorn's desperation exceeded his restraint. Holmes gathered the papers from the table and placed them in a folder with the deliberate care of a man assembling a dossier. Then he crossed to the wall, and from the network of radiating lines around the initials PT, he drew a single heavy stroke to a new note that he pinned at the centre. Percival Thorn, collector, debtor, thief. He stood back and regarded his work. The wall now resembled a mechanism in its own right, a schematic of cause and effect, of connection and concealment, with Thorn at its centre like a mainspring wound to the point of breaking. There remain 2 tasks, Watson. First, I must confirm that the watch offered to the Amsterdam market is indeed the Vaucanson, and that the chain of sale leads back to Thorn. For this, I have sent word to my contacts in the antiquities underworld to trace the intermediary. Second, I must eliminate Leonard Hargrove conclusively from Lestrade's calculations, as the inspector's attachment to the Nephew theory is becoming an impediment to the investigation. He tapped the 3rd name on his original list, the name he had crossed out that morning with a firm horizontal line. Voigt is cleared. Alderton is cleared. The last name on a short list is either the answer or a dead end, Watson. He turned from the wall, and his eyes held the particular brightness that came upon him when a case approached its crisis. Not triumph, not excitement, but the focused, almost solemn intensity of a mechanism engaging its final gear. Let us see which. Chapter 8. The Will and the Workbench. It was Holmes's habit, when an investigation reached a critical juncture, to revisit the foundations before building the final structure. Lesser minds rushed forward. Holmes circled back. He understood that the most dangerous moment in any case was not the beginning, when ignorance was acknowledged, but the middle passage, when partial knowledge bred the illusion of certainty. And so, on the morning of January the 22nd, 1 week after Elias Hargrove's death, Holmes announced that we would be making 2 visits, the first to a solicitor's office in Lincoln's Inn Fields, the second to the workshop on Clerkenwell Close. "I want to see the will," he said, pulling on his gloves with the brisk efficiency of a man who has made a decision during the night and intends to act upon it before breakfast is settled. Not as Lestrade understands it. Lestrade has been told that Leonard is the heir, and he has built his case upon that assumption like a man constructing a house on sand. I want to see the document itself, with its dates and its amendments and whatever story they tell. The offices of Messrs. Pemberton and Crail occupied the second floor of a dignified building on the south side of Lincoln's Inn Fields, behind a door whose brass plate had been polished so frequently that the letters had taken on the soft, rounded quality of inscriptions worn by centuries of rain. Mr. Crail, the surviving partner, Pemberton having departed for a jurisdiction beyond the reach of English law some years prior, was a small, precise man of 70, whose office contained more paper per square foot than any space I had encountered outside the British Museum's storage vaults. He received us with the cautious courtesy of a solicitor who recognises that cooperation with Sherlock Holmes is both a professional courtesy and, in the long run, considerably less troublesome than resistance. "Mr. Hargrove's will," Crail said, producing a folder from a cabinet with the sure hand of a man who knew exactly where every document in his possession resided. "I have been expecting an inquiry. Inspector Lestrade's men took a copy last week, but I had the impression they were looking for confirmation rather than information, a distinction that, in my experience, makes all the difference." "When was the will last amended?" Holmes asked. Crail opened the folder and turned to a page near the back. The original will was executed in March of 1890. At that time, the sole beneficiary was Leonard Hargrove, Mr. Hargrove's nephew, and, at that point, his nearest living relation with whom he maintained contact. The will left the workshop, its contents, and a modest sum in savings to Leonard outright. And the amendment? Executed on the 23rd of December, 1894, 3 weeks before Mr. Hargrove's death. Crail adjusted his spectacles and read from the document with the measured cadence of a man for whom legal language was a native tongue. The amendment substantially altered the distribution. Leonard Hargrove was removed as beneficiary entirely. The workshop, its contents, all tools and stock, and the sum of £150 in savings were to be divided equally between 2 parties: Samuel Finch, identified as Mr. Hargrove's apprentice, and Margaret Hargrove, identified as his daughter. Holmes leaned forward. Margaret Hargrove, the estranged daughter. Formally estranged, it would appear. Mr. Hargrove came to this office on the 23rd of December in what I can only describe as an unusual state of emotion. He was not a sentimental man. In our professional dealings over the years, he had always been direct, practical, and somewhat brusque, but on that occasion he was... Crail paused, searching for the precise term with the care of a man who understood the weight of words in legal contexts. Moved. He told me that he had made a grave error in cutting his daughter from his life, and that he wished to begin correcting it. He said that Margaret and young Finch were the only people who truly understood the value of what he had built, and that they should be the ones to carry it forward. Did he say anything about Leonard? He said, and I quote as nearly as I can recall, "Leonard wants to sell what I have spent my life building. I will not leave my clocks to a man who sees them as inventory." It was said without malice, more with resignation than with anger. I had the impression that Mr. Hargrove had arrived at this decision slowly and with some pain. And Leonard? Was he informed of the change? He was not. Mr. Hargrove was quite specific on this point. He said he intended to tell Leonard in person, in his own time, and that the conversation would require careful handling. As far as I'm aware, that conversation never took place. Holmes sat in silence for a moment, his gaze resting on the document with the concentrated focus of a man reading not merely the words but their implications. Then he rose, thanked Crail with a brevity that bordered on curtness, and was halfway down the stairs before I had finished buttoning my coat. Leonard did not know, he said, as we emerged into the cold air of Lincoln's Inn Fields. He argued with his uncle about selling the shop. He stole from the workshop to pay his debts. He went to a public house on the evening of the murder and sat there nursing his pints and his grievances, convinced that he stood to inherit everything, and all the while the will had already been changed. His motive, Watson, is a phantom. He was fighting for a prize that had already been removed from the table. Lestrade will not take this well. Lestrade will take it exactly as he takes every correction, with initial resistance, subsequent grudging acceptance, and eventual retrospective certainty that he saw the truth all along. But that is Lestrade's burden to bear. Ours is the workshop. We arrived at Clerkenwell Close shortly before noon. The lane was so quiet, the subdued quiet of a working street in winter, where the sounds of industry are muffled by closed doors and drawn curtains. Holmes did not enter the workshop immediately. He stood on the pavement for a full minute, his eyes moving across the facade with the slow, systematic attention of a man rereading a text he has already committed to memory, looking not for what is present, but for what he might have missed. Then he entered, and for the next 2 hours I witnessed the most comprehensive and methodical reconstruction of a crime scene that I have ever had the privilege to observe. Holmes began at the workbench. He stood where Hargrove would have stood, facing the tool cabinet on the far wall, the cabinet from which, according to the scenario Holmes had constructed, Hargrove had turned to retrieve a loop when Thorne reached for the Vaucanson watch. He measured the distance from the workbench to the cabinet, 4 feet. He timed the turn, the natural rotation of a man pivoting on his heel to face an unexpected movement behind him, less than 1 second. Hargrove turns, Holmes narrated, performing the movement himself. He sees Thorne reaching across the bench. His hand closes on Thorne's wrist, hence the wool fibres under his nails. There is a struggle. Thorne shoves him. Holmes placed both hands flat against an imaginary chest and pushed. Backward. Hargrove stumbles. 1 step, perhaps 2, and the base of his skull strikes the iron corner brace of the workbench. He crouched beside the bench and examined the brace once more, his lens hovering over the faint discoloration that I had identified during our first visit. The contact point is approximately 3 feet and 2 inches from the floor, consistent with the height at which the base of the skull of a man of Hargrove's stature would meet this edge if he were falling backward from a standing position. The wound, as you confirmed at the mortuary, is a concentrated linear laceration at precisely this location. The geometry is unambiguous. He straightened and moved to the space between the workbench and the ladder. Now, the killer has a dead man at his feet, and approximately 20 minutes before his nerve fails or his luck runs out, he must transform a murder into an accident. He grasps Hargrove by the shoulders and drags him to the base of the ladder, 3 feet. He walked the distance slowly, his eyes on the floor. The drag marks are here, the parallel scores left by Hargrove's boot heels as they trailed across the stone. The width between the marks matches Hargrove's shoulder breadth. The arc of the curve is consistent with a man adjusting his path as he pulls a dead weight toward a specific destination. He reached the ladder and looked up. He climbs. He pulls items from the shelf and throws them to the floor around the body. Brass housings, gears, winding tools. He wants it to look as though Hargrove fell while reaching for something on the high shelf, but he makes a critical error. Holmes climbed 3 rungs of the ladder and pointed to the uppermost shelf. The dust. Every object that has sat on this shelf for months has left a clean impression in the accumulated dust. The rectangular housings match rectangular gaps. That much is consistent. But the marble mantel clock that was found on the floor beside the body has a circular base, and there is no circular gap on this shelf. The clock came from elsewhere. The killer grabbed it from another part of the workshop and added it to the debris for weight and verisimilitude. The dust betrays him. He descended and moved to the iron corner brace. He wipes the impact point with a cloth he finds in Hargrove's apron. Or perhaps the cloth was already on the bench used for polishing. He cleans the blood, but not thoroughly enough. Microscopic traces remain in the grain of the iron. He tucks the cloth back into the apron pocket, into the pocket of a dead man, Watson, which requires a particular quality of composure that I do not associate with panic. This was a man thinking clearly under extraordinary pressure. Holmes stood in the centre of the workshop now, surrounded by the silent testimony of 100 clocks, and turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the room as though confirming that every element of his reconstruction was accounted for. He takes the Vaucanson watch from the workbench. He checks the scene one final time. He exits through the front door, locks it behind him with Hargrove's key, and walks briskly to Blackfriars Bridge, where he drops the key into the Thames at approximately 10 minutes past 5. He continues to his club on Pall Mall, arriving at 5:30 and signs the member's log, establishing an alibi that begins 90 minutes too late to be of any use. He paused and looked at me. The case against the unknown visitor is complete, Watson. The physical evidence, wound geometry, drag marks, dust patterns, blood-stained cloth, missing key, missing watch, forms a coherent and internally consistent narrative. Every element points to a man who came from outside Hargrove's daily world, committed an unplanned killing, staged the scene with improvised skill, and departed with the one object that justified the risk. Percival Thorne. Percival Thorne. The appointment book gives us his initials. Mrs. Doyle gives us his description. Tall, dark overcoat, silver-headed cane. The chestnut vendor on Blackfriars Bridge gives us his route of departure. The club's sign-in log gives us the end of his journey. The Continental Market gives us the stolen watch, offered for sale through London channels within days of the killing, and his debts, £2,000 owed to a man who does not accept apologies, give us the motive that transforms a theft into a catastrophe. He crossed to the wall where he had, during that first visit, stood in the doorway and declared that he saw a man who had been placed rather than fallen. Now he placed his hand flat against the plaster, as though drawing something from the building itself, some final confirmation that the story the workshop told was true. The clockmaker's final client didn't come to fix a clock, Watson. He came to steal a miracle, and when the miracle's guardian resisted, the client became a murderer. We stood in silence for a moment. The clocks that Finch had faithfully wound continued their layered ticking, a sound that had, over the course of our visits, shifted in my perception from mechanical background noise to something more resonant. It was the sound of a life's work persisting beyond its maker, each tick a small act of defiance against the silence that Thorne had tried to impose. Holmes removed his hand from the wall and buttoned his coat. There remain 2 things to be done. First, I must trace the watch to Thorne through the Amsterdam connection. I need the chain of intermediaries, the paper trail, the proof that the Vaucanson passed from this workbench to Thorne's hands, and from Thorne's hands to the Continental Market. Circumstantial evidence convicts in novels, Watson, but juries require something more tangible. And the second is a conversation with my brother. Thorne's club sits adjacent to the Diogenes Club, Mycroft's peculiar sanctuary. If anyone can confirm discreetly and without alarming the quarry that Thorne arrived at his club at 5:30 rather than the 3 o'clock he claims, it is Mycroft, though asking him to speak to anyone at all, even by proxy, will cost me a debt of fraternal goodwill that I may spend years repaying." He permitted himself a thin smile, the smile of a man who recognizes that the machinery of the case is engaged and turning, and that what remains is not deduction but pursuit. "Come, Watson, we have a ghost no longer. We have a man, with a name, a face, a history and a trail, of debts and stolen objects stretching back years. The fog is lifting, in more ways than one." We left the workshop, and I noticed, as Holmes locked the door behind us with the key Finch had provided, that he handled it with a care that seemed almost reverent, as though he understood that keys, in this particular case, carried a weight that exceeded their function. Chapter 9. The Gentleman Unravelled. Holmes sent word to Mycroft that same afternoon by means of a note delivered to the Diogenes Club by a boy from the Baker Street Irregulars, with strict instructions to hand it to the hall porter and depart without speaking. The Diogenes Club's rules regarding silence were, as Holmes had explained to me on more than one occasion, enforced with a rigour that bordered on the theological, and a chattering street urchin in the vestibule would have provoked a constitutional crisis among the membership. The reply arrived by the evening post, a single sheet of cream-coloured paper, bearing Mycroft's handwriting, which was the precise opposite of his brother's. Where Sherlock's script was angular and impatient, Mycroft's was round, measured, and somehow conveyed the impression that the writer had all the time in the world and found the act of communication a regrettable necessity. "Dear Sherlock, the club adjacent to ours, the Palace, since you did not trouble yourself to name it, maintains a member's log at the front desk. I have, through channels that required me to exchange words with a living person, a concession I trust you will not ask of me again before the century turns, obtained the relevant information. Your man Thorne signed the log at 5:32 p.m. on the 15th of January. There is no earlier entry for that date. The porter on duty that afternoon recalls Thorne arriving in something of a hurry, though he could not say from which direction. I am told Thorne claimed, when later asked by a fellow member, that he had been at the club since 3:00 and had simply forgotten to sign in, a claim the porter finds implausible, as the front desk is directly beside the entrance, and Thorne would have had to walk past it. Speaking to the members next door is still more social exertion than I prefer in a calendar year. I trust you will not require further assistance of this nature. Your brother, Monsieur Holmes, read the note aloud to me, and I could not help but smile at Mycroft's complaint, delivered, as always, in the tone of a man who regarded human interaction as a mild but persistent ailment for which no reliable cure had yet been discovered. Holmes himself received it with a brief, sharp laugh, one of the rare moments of genuine amusement that his brother's correspondence provoked, before folding the note and adding it to the growing dossier on the dining table. 5:32, he said. Not 3:00, as Thorne claims. The gap between 4:00, the time of his appointment with Hargrove, and 5:32 is 1 hour and 32 minutes. Subtract 25 minutes for the walk from Clerkenwell to Blackfriars Bridge, 5 minutes on the bridge for the disposal of the key, and 20 minutes from the bridge to Pall Mall, and you are left with approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes inside the workshop, for the appraisal pretense, the theft attempt, the struggle, the death, and the staging of the scene. It is tight, Watson, but it is sufficient. Every minute is accounted for. He pinned Mycroft's note to the wall beside the other documents and stepped back to survey the complete picture. The wall above the fireplace, already scarred by his earlier ballistic contributions, now bore the full architecture of the case, the appointment book entry, Mrs. Doyle's description, the chestnut vendor's account, the club sign-in time, the physical evidence from the workshop, the continental market intelligence, and the emerging biography of Percival Thorne. Seen together, the documents formed a pattern that was less a web than a mechanism, each piece interlocking with the next, in a sequence that had the cold, precise logic of the clockwork that pervaded every dimension of the case. Now, Holmes said, turning from the wall with the focused energy of a man entering the final phase of a campaign. The watch. He had dispatched inquiries through his network of underworld contacts 2 days earlier, the shadowy community of informants, dealers and intermediaries who operated in the spaces between London's legitimate antiquities trade and its criminal margins. Holmes's relationship with this network was one of the aspects of his professional life that I understood least and admired most. He did not employ these men in the conventional sense. Rather, he had cultivated over years of casework a web of mutual obligations and earned trust that functioned as a kind of alternative civil service, less efficient than Scotland Yard, considerably less scrupulous and immeasurably better informed. The first response came that evening in the form of a visit from a man Holmes introduced only as Shinwell. He was a compact, weathered individual, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime assessing the intentions of others and the worn hands of someone who had not always assessed them correctly. He sat in our sitting room with the uneasy alertness of a cat in a strange house, and addressed his remarks exclusively to Holmes, treating my presence with the polite indifference of a man for whom doctors occupied a different and largely irrelevant stratum of society. "Your watch has been on the move, Mr. Holmes," Shinwell said, accepting a whisky with a nod that served as both thanks and the termination of all social pleasantry. "Word went out through the usual channels about 10 days ago, a piece described as an 18th century automaton pocket watch, Swiss make, songbird mechanism, exceptional rarity. No provenance documents, which tells its own story. The asking price was £1,500, negotiable for a quick sale." The seller? The seller is operating through a middleman, a man named Jessup, who runs a small antiquities brokerage out of rooms on Berry Street near St. James's. Jessup is what you might call a facilitator. He doesn't ask where things come from, and his clients don't ask where things go. He takes a commission, 15%, and handles the correspondence, the authentication, and the logistics of delivery. And the buyer? A Dutchman, Van der Hoorn, based in Amsterdam, collector of mechanical curiosities, automata, musical boxes, that sort of thing. Deep pockets, deeper discretion. Jessup made the initial approach through a contact in The Hague, and Van der Hoorn expressed immediate interest. The negotiation has been conducted entirely by letter, with Jessup acting as intermediary. Has the transaction been completed? Not yet. Van der Hoorn wants an authentication. He's sent word that he requires a physical examination of the piece before he commits the funds. Jessup has proposed a meeting in London at a neutral location within the next few days. The watch is still in Jessup's possession, held in his rooms on Berry Street. Holmes's eyes had taken on the particular brightness that I associated with the convergence of a case, the moment when separate threads of evidence twisted together into a single cord strong enough to bear the weight of a prosecution. And the seller, the man who brought the watch to Jessup, do you have a name? Shinwell took a measured sip of his whisky. Jessup doesn't volunteer names, and his clients don't use their real ones as a rule. But the man who delivered the watch to Jessup's rooms was described to me by Jessup's clerk, a young lad who is somewhat more talkative than his employer, particularly after his second pint at the Lamb and Flag. Tall gentleman, all well-dressed, dark overcoat, carried a walking stick with a silver handle. The description settled into the room like a final gear engaging its partner. Holmes nodded once, slowly, with the deliberate satisfaction of a man who has heard the click of a lock opening. "One more question, Shinwell. Can you get word to Jessup, discreetly, that Van der Hoorn has sent a representative to London, and that this representative wishes to meet the seller directly before the authentication proceeds? Van der Hoorn insists, as a condition of the purchase, on meeting the man behind the sale." Shinwell considered this. Jessup won't like it. He prefers to keep his clients separated. It's better for business and better for his health. But if the message comes from Van der Hoorn's side, with the implication that the deal falls through otherwise, Jessup will arrange it. The commission is too large to lose over protocol. Excellent. Arrange the meeting for Friday afternoon, a public. Location, a tea room or a hotel lounge, somewhere respectable enough that a gentleman would not feel out of place. And Shinwell, the representative from Van der Horn, will be me. Shinwell finished his whisky, set the glass on the side table with the precision of a man who is accustomed to leaving no marks, and departed without ceremony. Holmes watched him go, then turned to me with an expression that combined the focus of the investigator with something rarer and more personal, a quiet, almost solemn recognition that the case had passed from the realm of deduction into the realm of consequence. "We have him, Watson, not yet in hand, but in sight. The watch is in Jessup's rooms on Berry Street. The chain of sale runs from Thorn to Jessup to Van der Horn. When Thorn arrives at Friday's meeting expecting a Dutch buyer's agent, he will find instead a consulting detective, an inspector of Scotland Yard, and 2 constables. The trap is set. All that remains is for the quarry to walk into it. And if he doesn't come, if he suspects, he will come. A man with a £2,000 debt and a month-end deadline does not have the luxury of suspicion. Cray's men will not accept excuses, and Thorn knows it. The watch is his only exit. He will come because he must." Holmes spent the following day in a state of concentrated preparation that I had witnessed before the resolution of several major cases. He visited Lestrade at Scotland Yard and laid out the full case in a 2-hour meeting from which the inspector emerged, looking simultaneously deflated and galvanized. Deflated because his cherished theory about Leonard had been dismantled with clinical thoroughness, and galvanized because the true solution, when presented in its entirety, was considerably more compelling than the one he had constructed himself. Lestrade took it well, Holmes reported upon his return, in the tone of a man grading a student's performance on a difficult examination, which is to say he argued for 20 minutes, fell silent for 5, asked 3 intelligent questions in succession, which may be a personal record, and then agreed to provide 2 plain-clothed constables for Friday's operation. He also, to his credit, acknowledged that the will amendment renders the case against Leonard untenable. I believe his exact words were, "Well, I suppose the nephew was too obvious," which represents for Lestrade a remarkable degree of self-awareness. The arrangements for Friday were meticulous. Shinwell had conveyed the message to Jessup, who had, as predicted, overcome his reservations when faced with the prospect of losing his commission. A meeting had been set for 3 o'clock at Farringdon's, a respectable tea-room on Jermyn Street frequented by gentlemen of the collecting fraternity. Jessup would send word to his client, Thorn, that the Dutch representative required a face-to-face meeting as a condition of the sale. Thorn would arrive, expecting commerce. He would find justice. On the evening before the meeting, Holmes stood at the window of our sitting-room, looking out at Baker Street in the lamplight. The fog had gone at last, truly gone, not merely retreated, and the street lay clear and sharp in the winter darkness, every edge defined, every shadow cast with precision. "Watson," he said, without turning, "tomorrow we close the case, but I find myself thinking not of the arrest, but of the workshop, of the clocks that Finch keeps winding, of the letter that Margaret sent to a father who was already dead, of the Vaucanson watch, that extraordinary object, that miracle of human ingenuity, reduced by Thorn to nothing more than currency, a thing to be sold, a debt to be cleared." He turned from the window. His expression was one I had seen only rarely, not the sharp analytical focus of the detective, but something quieter and more troubled. There is a particular cruelty, Watson, in the destruction of something irreplaceable by someone who cannot perceive its value. Thorn looked at that watch and saw £1,500. Hargrove looked at it and saw 200 years of human brilliance, compressed into a mechanism small enough to hold in the palm of one's hand. The distance between those two perceptions is, I think, the distance between civilization and its opposite. He shook his head as though clearing away a thought that did not serve the immediate purpose, and his expression reassembled itself into the familiar mask of professional composure. Forgive the philosophy, Watson. It is an indulgence I permit myself on the eve of an arrest when the puzzle is solved and only the execution remains. Tomorrow I shall be entirely mechanical. He smiled, a thin, self-aware smile, and reached for his violin. The music he played that evening was Bach, and it filled the rooms of 221B with a precision and a beauty that seemed, in the circumstances, like an answer to a question that neither of us had quite managed to articulate. Chapter 10. The Clockmaker's Final Client. Farringdon's Tea Room on Jermyn Street was the sort of establishment that had perfected the art of unobtrusiveness. Its furnishings were handsome without being ostentatious, its service attentive without being intrusive, and its clientele of the variety that valued discretion above all other amenities. It was, in short, precisely the kind of place where a gentleman might conduct a piece of private business without attracting notice, which was, of course, why Holmes had chosen it. We arrived at 2:30. Lestrade and his two plainclothes constables were already in position. The constables seated at a corner table with cups of tea and newspapers, performing the role of idle gentlemen with a conviction that suggested either natural talent or extensive rehearsal. Lestrade himself occupied a chair near the service door, partially screened by a potted aspidistra, and had adopted an expression of studied nonchalance that would have deceived no one who knew him, but might, I conceded, pass muster with a stranger. Holmes selected a table near the centre of the room, visible from the entrance, well lit, and positioned so that the only exit required passing either Lestrade's aspidistra or the constable's corner. He ordered tea for two with the unhurried manner of a man keeping an afternoon appointment of no particular consequence, and arranged himself in his chair with the relaxed authority of someone who belonged exactly where he was. "Jessup sent confirmation this morning," he said, stirring his tea. "Thorn accepted the meeting without hesitation. He believes he is meeting a representative of Van der Hoorn, a Dutchman's agent, here to finalize the terms of the Vaucanson sale. He will arrive at 3:00, expecting to discuss authentication, delivery, and payment. He will not be expecting us." "And if he recognizes you?" "He will not. Thorn and I do not move in the same circles, and I have taken care to ensure that my involvement in the Hargrove investigation has not reached the press. To Thorn, I shall be a stranger, at least until I choose to be otherwise." The minutes passed with the particular slowness that attends anticipation. I drank my tea. Holmes did not touch his. His eyes were fixed on the entrance with the patient, unblinking focus of a man who has learned that the final moments of a case reward vigilance above all other virtues. At 3:07, Percival Thorn entered Farringdon's. He was, I must admit, impressive. Tall, an inch or two above 6 feet, with the upright carriage and easy movement of a man who had been taught, probably from birth, that physical presence was a form of social currency. His overcoat was dark and impeccably cut, his hat removed with a smooth, practised gesture as he crossed the threshold, and his silver-headed cane, the same cane, described by Mrs. Doyle, by the chestnut vendor, by Shinwell's account of Jessup's clerk, was tucked under his arm with the casual authority of a man for whom such accessories were as natural as breathing. His face was clean-shaven, regular in feature, and wore an expression of composed expectancy, the look of a man arriving for a business meeting that he fully intended to control. He scanned the room. His gaze passed over Lestrade without interest, dismissed the constables as irrelevant, and settled on Holmes with the quick, evaluative glance of a man accustomed to reading strangers for advantage. Whatever he saw evidently satisfied him, because he crossed to our table with the confident stride of a man who believes the next hour will resolve his problems. "Mr. van der Hoorn's representative, I presume," he said, extending his hand. His voice was smooth, cultured, and carried the faintest edge of urgency beneath its polish, the sound of a man who needs the meeting to go well, and is therefore working harder than usual to ensure that it does. Holmes shook the offered hand and gestured to the empty chair. "Please sit down, Mr. Thorn. I appreciate your coming." Thorn sat. He leaned his cane against the table edge, ordered coffee from the approaching waiter with the ease of a man who had ordered coffee in 100 such rooms, and turned his attention to Holmes with the focused charm of a professional negotiator. "Jessup tells me your principal requires a personal meeting before committing to the purchase. I understand the caution. At this level of the market, trust is paramount. I can assure you that the piece is genuine. I have documentation of its provenance stretching back to—" "Mr. Thorn," Holmes said quietly, and something in his tone, a shift of register so subtle that it might have been missed by anyone not listening for it, caused Thorn to stop mid-sentence. "I am not here on behalf of Mr. van der Hoorn, and I am not interested in provenance documentation, which I suspect you do not possess in any case." A silence followed, brief but dense with recalculation. I watched Thorn's face undergo a transformation that was fascinating in its discipline. The initial flash of alarm lasted less than a second before it was suppressed, replaced by a careful, watchful neutrality that betrayed nothing except the fact that something was being concealed. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Thorn said. His voice had not changed, his posture had not changed, but his right hand, which had been resting on the table, moved fractionally toward his cane. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. I am a consulting detective. I've been engaged in the investigation of the death of Elias Hargrove, master clockmaker of Clerkenwell Close, who was killed in his workshop on the afternoon of January the 15th. Holmes spoke with a measured, unhurried precision that gave each fact the weight of a stone being placed on a scale. "I believe you are the man who killed him, and I believe the object you are attempting to sell to Mr. van der Hoorn, the Vaucanson automaton watch, is the object you stole from his workbench after his death." Thorn did not move. For a long moment he sat perfectly still, his coffee untouched before him, his eyes fixed on Holmes with an expression that had passed beyond alarm into something colder and more calculating, the look of a man rapidly assessing his options and finding them insufficient. "That is an extraordinary accusation," he said, "and entirely without foundation. I acquired the watch through legitimate channels, a private sale, some years ago, from a dealer in Geneva. I have never set foot in Mr. Hargrove's workshop, and I deeply resent the implication." "You set foot in Mr. Hargrove's workshop at 4:15 on the afternoon of January the 15th, Holmes replied, and now his voice carried the quiet, implacable force of a mechanism that has been set in motion and cannot be stopped. "You entered under the pretext of a carriage clock appraisal, an appointment recorded in Hargrove's own hand in his appointment ledger, under your initials, PT, 4 o'clock. You were seen entering the shop by Mrs. Agnes Doyle, proprietor of the tea shop across the lane, who described a tall gentleman in a dark overcoat carrying a silver-headed cane, a description that matches you precisely." Thorn opened his mouth. Holmes continued without pause. "Once inside, you saw the Vaucanson watch on Hargrove's workbench. You reached for it. Hargrove turned from his tool cabinet and caught you in the act. He seized your wrist, your coat sleeve more precisely, as the dark wool fibres found beneath his fingernails confirm. A struggle followed. You shoved Hargrove backward with both hands. He fell against the iron corner brace of his workbench, striking the base of his skull. The wound, a concentrated linear laceration with sharp margins, is consistent with that edge and inconsistent with a fall from any height onto a flat surface. Hargrove died almost immediately." Thorn's composure had begun to fracture. The smooth, controlled surface was developing fissures, a tightening around the eyes, a rigidity in the jaw, the barely perceptible acceleration of breathing that marks a man whose body is responding to truth, even as his mind attempts to deny it. You then stage the scene, Holmes continued. You drag the body 3 feet from the workbench to the base of a tall shelf ladder. The drag marks on the stone floor match the width of Hargrove's shoulders and the arc of a body pulled by the arms. You climb the ladder and knocked items from the high shelf to simulate a fall, but you included a marble mantel clock, whose circular base left no corresponding impression in the dust on the shelf, because the clock did not come from the shelf. The dust patterns prove the staging. You wipe the blood from the workbench edge with a cloth that you then tucked into Hargrove's apron pocket. The cloth retains microscopic blood traces consistent with a directional wipe across a narrow surface. You pocketed the Vaucanson watch, exited through the front door, locked it behind you with Hargrove's key, and walked to Blackfriars Bridge, where a chestnut vendor observed you pausing at the railing at approximately 10 minutes past 5 and saw you drop something into the Thames. You then continued to your club on Pall Mall, where you signed the members' log at 5:32, not 3 o'clock as you later claimed. Your alibi begins 90 minutes after the murder and covers nothing. Holmes paused. The tea room had grown very quiet. At the corner table, the constables had set down their newspapers. Behind the aspidistra, Lestrade had risen to his feet. The watch, Holmes said, was delivered by you to Marcus Jessup of Berry Street, who offered it to a collector in Amsterdam for £1,500, approximately the sum required to discharge your debts to a gentleman known as Mr. Cray, whose deadline for repayment is, I believe, the end of this month. Your family estate was repossessed 2 years ago. Your fortune is gone. Your career as a collector has been sustained by the systematic theft of objects from the homes and collections of people who trusted you. The Vaucanson watch was to be your salvation, the one theft large enough to clear the debt and buy you time. But it required a murder that you did not plan, and a deception that you could not sustain. He leaned forward slightly. Each piece locks into the next, Mr. Thorne, like the gears of a well-made clock. The appointment book, the eyewitness, the wound, the staging, the dust, the cloth, the key, the bridge, the club, the watch, the debt. Remove any single element, and the mechanism still runs. That is not circumstance. That is truth. Thorne sat motionless for a long moment. Then something shifted. Behind his eyes, the final collapse of a structure that had been built on pretense and maintained by will. And when he spoke, his voice had lost its polish. It was not supposed to happen that way, he said. I came for the watch. Only for the watch. Hargrove was supposed to be showing me the carriage clock. I planned to distract him, take the Vaucanson, and be gone before he noticed. But the old man was fast. Faster than I expected. He turned and grabbed my arm and looked at me with... He stopped. His jaw worked. He looked at me as though I had broken something that could not be repaired. Not anger. Something worse. Disappointment. And I panicked. I pushed him. I only meant to free myself. He fell and there was a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. And then he was on the floor, and his eyes were open, and I knew. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had shoved an old man to his death, and said nothing more. Percival Thorne, said Lestrade, stepping from behind the aspidistra with the grim formality of a man performing a duty he took no pleasure in. I am arresting you for the murder of Elias Hargrove. The constables rose from their corner. The tea room's other patrons, who had been following the exchange with the frozen attention of people witnessing something they did not entirely comprehend, parted wordlessly as Thorne was led to the door. He went without resistance, his silver-headed cane left behind against the table edge like a prop from a play that had reached its final curtain. The days that followed brought resolution, though not the uncomplicated kind. The Vaucanson watch was recovered from Jessop's rooms on Berry Street, intact and unharmed. Holmes personally oversaw its return to the workshop on Clerkenwell Close, where Samuel Finch received it with a reverence that required no words. He placed it on the workbench, in the precise spot where it had last rested under his master's hands, and stood looking at it for a long time before he spoke. "He would have wanted it kept running," Finch said. "Then keep it running," Holmes replied. It was during this visit that the reconciliation letter was discovered. Finch had been sorting through a small pile of posts that had accumulated at the workshop since Hargrove's death. Trade circulars, invoices, a catalogue from a part supplier in Birmingham, and among them, postmarked January the 15th and addressed in a careful feminine hand, was an envelope that had never been opened. Finch looked at the handwriting and went very still. "Margaret," he said. Holmes took the envelope gently from Finch's hand, examined the postmark and handed it back. "It was posted from Kensington at 3:30 on the afternoon of your master's death. He never saw it, but it was sent, Mr. Finch. The intent was real." Finch opened the letter and read it in silence. "I did not see its contents. That was a private matter between a daughter and the memory of her father. But I saw Finch's face as he read, and what passed across it was not grief alone, but something more complex. The particular anguish of a hope that had been fulfilled too late to matter, and yet mattered enormously nonetheless. Holmes, with a gentleness I had rarely witnessed in him, suggested that Finch and Margaret should read the letter together. Finch nodded, unable to speak, and Holmes and I left the workshop and walked out into Clerkenwell Close, where the winter afternoon was fading into the early dark of January. We did not speak for some time. The lane was quiet, the workshops closing for the day, the sounds of the city muffled by the coming dusk. It was Holmes who broke the silence, as we turned onto St. John Street, and the lamplight caught the planes of his face. "Hargrove changed his will on the 23rd of December, he said. He reinstated Margaret as his heir. 3 weeks later, she sent a letter of reconciliation. Father and daughter were reaching toward each other, Watson, independently, simultaneously, across a silence of 3 years. And Thorne's act of greed severed the bridge before either of them could cross it." He walked a few more steps in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, his breath visible in the cold air. "That is the true crime, Watson. Not the theft of a watch or even the taking of a life, but the destruction of a reconciliation that was already in motion. The clockmaker and his daughter had set something delicate and precious into operation, something that required only time to complete, and a desperate man with empty pockets smashed it because he could not see what it was. We reached Baker Street as the last light was leaving the sky. Mrs. Hudson had built up the fire and the sitting room was warm and golden in the lamplight. Holmes settled into his chair and I into mine, and for a while we sat in the companionable silence of two men who have shared an experience that does not require further commentary. It was late, nearly 11, when Holmes spoke again. He was gazing into the fire, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in the posture I knew so well. But his expression was not the restless, hungry look of a man between cases. It was something quieter, something, I might almost say, at peace. Time is the clockmaker's medium, Watson. Hargrove spent his life mastering it, but in the end, even the finest clockmaker cannot make time run backward. The letter arrived. The intent was real. That, I think, is not nothing. I looked at my friend across the firelight and saw, for a moment, not the calculating machine, not the cold logician, not the brilliant, difficult, impossible man I had shared rooms with for so many years, but a man who understood loss, who recognized the weight of things that could not be undone, and who chose, in the end, to find meaning in the attempt rather than despair in the failure. I opened my notebook and wrote, at the top of a fresh page, the title that would remain unchanged through every subsequent draft.